Today, I'm speaking with Athena Aktipis. Athena is an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at Arizona State University, where she's the director of the Cooperation and Conflict Lab and the Human Generosity Project. Her research interests lie at the intersection of cooperation theory, evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, and cancer biology. She also started the Zombified podcast, where she and a co-host explore various ways that organisms, including people, can be tricked into ceasing to pursue the actual goals that they have or ought to have. In 2020, she wrote The Cheating Cell, How Evolution Helps Us Understand and Treat Cancer, which is going to be the starting point for today's conversation and was a book that I really loved. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Athena.
Thank you so much for having me here. I am really excited to talk to you about all of the things. So,
yeah, I think some of my friends have been a little. It's been just cancer for me this week for my housemates and colleagues. So I'm going to be able to get all of the cancer stuff out of my system and then stop hassling them about it. Or I can hassle all the listeners all at once. So I hope we're going to get to talk about what cancer really is at a theoretical level and what we might possibly be able to learn about societal cooperation from intercellular cooperation. But first, as always, what are you working on at the moment, and why do you think it's important?
Oh, what am I working on at the moment? I am so deep right now in trying to finish my next book, which is called Everything is Fine, How to Thrive in the Apocalypse. So, it's like a playful take on existential risk and how we can deal with it as the social beings that we are. Yeah.
How did you end up writing that book?
I ended up writing this book because I just could not stop thinking about and talking about these issues. You know, when, even before COVID, I was sort of already using the apocalypse as a way of thinking about and talking about existential risk that I thought was maybe a little bit more playful and fun, and appealing than just, the sort of more straight approach to it. And then the pandemic happened, and then that kind of just accelerated, very quickly, people were just talking about the apocalypse, we're in the apocalypse. And I think that actually provided some, levity almost to just be it's the apocalypse. And so I just kind of leaned into that and, started, doing more live streaming. We started Channel Z, which is, television in the zombie apocalypse, which is basically just an excuse to make a bunch of TV shows that address issues what are the risks that we're facing? How can we work together in community to deal with it? How can we prepare as individuals? And how can we just understand our world using evolutionary biology, using a really interdisciplinary approach that includes both science and humanities, and sort of considering policy and ethics, bring all of those things together, bring all those people together to start thinking and talking about those issues. So that really kind of got me going in that direction. And then at some point I was just I want to write a book to get these ideas across, with a playful tone, with illustrations. It ended up being something that Workman was really interested in. And so, then just kind of got set on that pathway, and it's been really fun, I have to say.
Nice. All right. Well, we'll come back to the apocalypse, I think, later in the interview. But I suppose for now, we're going to do cancer. So I said,
it's what are we going to talk about? How about some really morbid topics like cancer and the apocalypse? Just choose which one.
I suppose a more positive framing on it is cooperation. So I guess I said in the intro that you're a cooperation theorist. Because what is cooperation at kind of the highest level of abstraction? Because I guess your whole thing is thinking about cooperation at a high level, and then you can use that to analyze all kinds of different ways that different organisms, or even subatomic, molecules that even interact with one another.
Yeah. I mean, my whole thing is looking at the world through the lens of cooperation and conflict too, sort of as these organizing principles. And just with physics, the rules of physics, the laws of physics apply at all scales, right? Now, some laws of physics apply maybe more at some scales than others, just because of the way the universe is set up. I think is really similar with the laws kind of underlying cooperation. There are many things that apply across systems and scales, but then there's some things that apply more to some systems than others. So, for example, you can look at things like, division of labor, like that's a basis of cooperation across pretty much all systems that have cooperation, that you can have division of labor, or, in many systems, that's something that you can have. Economies of scale, right? That's another one where it's like, as you scale up, some things become more efficient. Maybe you reach a point where that stops and then it becomes less efficient, right? So there are principles that apply. Another one is, that the larger and more complex a group is, all else being equal, the easier it will be for cheating to arise and go undetected and potentially undermine the system, unless you have other mechanisms there that can sort of, protect, monitor, respond. And so, that last idea, that last sort of, thread is really what the big picture inspiration was for the book, The Cheating Cell, right? So thinking about our bodies as this cooperative system, and as cancer, as a breakdown of that cellular cooperation. But yeah, big picture is we can look at cooperation at all these different levels and using different methods, right? And so that's another thing that has been really important to me in my career, is not just having one methodological approach or one disciplinary approach. So, bringing anthropological fieldwork together with, psychology experiments, together with computational modeling, and, doing all of that also in the context of considering policy implications, ethical implications, and having that be part of the same conversation, the same research project, not splitting those things out and then, having one place where you're like, oh, let's try to bring it all together. No, it's part of the process is having all those things happening at the same time, getting that cross-fertilization, and being able to, be truly interdisciplinary as a result. So that's what I love. And that's, a lot of what I've been doing in my career up until this point and hope to continue to do.
Nice. Okay, so the structure of the conversation that we're going to have here is we're going to work through some of the key insights about cancer biology that you put in the cheating cell. Then we're going to zoom out and consider analogies to cooperation at the human level, and then maybe even the species level or the planetary level. And then we might maybe zoom in and instead talk about a cooperation within cells rather than between them. Now, I guess before I saw this book, I thought of cancer kind of just as a disease that arises somewhat at random because of chance mutations in genes that happen to go wrong. And I guess there's a sense in which that is true, but it's not the whole story. And I guess the cheating cells made me see the tension between cancer and non-cancer very differently, and kind of as a far more fundamental phenomenon that comes along with life in all its forms, and probably and potentially could forever. I guess first up, what is the opposite of cancer?
The opposite of cancer, I would say, is multicellular cooperation. So basically the opposite of cancer is us. It's having a functional multicellular body that is cooperating effectively in order to make that multicellular body function.
Yeah. And then so what is cancer basically? What traits does cancer have, and how is that relevant to the lack of cooperation?
Sure. So we can look at multicellularity as arising as a result of 5 foundations of multicellular cooperation that made it possible. Inhibition of proliferation, the control of cell death, mechanisms for resource transfer, right? Because as you get bigger, you can't just rely on diffusion for resources. You have to somehow get resources into, the middle, basically, of a clump of cells. And you also have division of labor, right? So having multiple cell types can do multiple jobs, different expression states, things like that. And then you have the creation and maintenance of the extracellular environment, right? So this is all of the things that are on the outside of the cell that make the organism more viable. Proteins that are produced, the matrix in which all the cells are embedded, and that's an environment that can be really healthy, or it can be quite literally polluted by, acids and things like that, if cells are, being wasteful and messy, which they can be, right? So they can sort of be, cheaters in that sense of polluting their environment. So you have these 5 foundations of multicellular cooperation. And what we see with cancer is a breakdown in each of those, right? So cells will proliferate when they shouldn't. They won't die when they should. They avoid apoptosis. They won't engage in the kind of division of labor that they should, right? They will not sort of do the jobs that they're supposed to do. They'll monopolize resources, and they will trash the environment. And so you can get a breakdown in all of these foundations of multicellular cooperation. And in fact, when you look at, you sort of, take this sort of like grounded in theories of evolution of multicellularity approach with these, foundations of multicellularity, and you map that onto, how have cancer biologists looked at the phenotypes of cancer. So there's this framework called the hallmarks of cancer. That's sort of classic work. The breakdown in those foundations of multicellularity map very well onto the hallmarks of cancer. And we don't have to get into the details of this, but there's a couple places where it doesn't match up 100%, which are actually like really interesting and useful then to sort of take these frameworks from thinking of the evolution of multicellularity and ask, are we missing something in how we're defining cancer? Like division of labor originally was not really part of the hallmarks framework. And, we've suggested that a breakdown in differentiation should be considered a hallmark of cancer. And now things are kind of coming around to that actually being, part of how people are looking at, the sort of next generation now of the hallmarks of cancer. It's a good example of where, that sort of cross-fertilization between the fields and being able to have, collaborators and expertise and, reading in both fields and really trying to bring things together can lead to new insights. So, yeah, so I'll just put a pin in that one of like, okay, it can do things that you can't do if you just stay in one discipline.
Yeah. Part of the change in framework that I've had in my mind thinking about cancer is, when we imagine bacteria in the environment or bacteria living inside our cells, we understand that they're facing evolutionary pressures to figure out how they can replicate more, how they can get resources, how potentially if they're bad bacteria that our immune system doesn't like, that they are going to learn to evade the immune system and avoid our antibiotics and things like that. We don't normally think about our cells in that way because we don't normally think of each individual cell in us as having its own kind of interests, its own pursuits and its side project and its desire to replicate.
It's got a little side hustle going on,
Yeah. No, I'm just a liver during the day, So really what I want to be is a metastasis. But within our bodies during our lifetimes, our cells are facing the same kinds of evolutionary pressure that a bacteria within us would. And because so the cells within us, they replicate much faster than we do. We only replicate ourselves every 20, 30, 40 years or so. But the cells are turning over incredibly quickly, so their generation time is much faster. So they're evolving way more quickly than we do as an organism. And that gives them evolutionary time potentially to become more like bacteria that might be parasites on us. And that's kind of what's going on here. Yeah, is there anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is a big shift of perspective because especially as like somebody who's trained in evolutionary biology and like the default is to think about evolution as this really, really, really slow thing, right? But if you think about like what do the parameters of evolution look like within the body for cells that are evolving, or potentially evolving inside the body, you have super short generation times. You have just completely mind-blowing population sizes, right? And once you start getting, mutations existing, which you can get what's called a mutator phenotype, where then the, mutations just are sort of like going crazy. There's so much variation. So if you have, those kinds of parameters, then evolution by natural selection, and also, drift too, but, evolution by natural selection can go really, really fast. And you can get, the opportunity for, evolution by natural selection to operate just over the course of like cancer progression is much vaster than all of the evolutionary time that we have had, as humans since, Homo sapiens came about, right? So it's a lot. It's, orders of magnitude more. And so we just have to like shift to a different scale. Like I almost think of it in like the body is a world with all these different like ecosystems in it, and the cells, like they're existing on a time scale that like, if we're going to map it onto anything like what we experience, like a day is at least, 10 years for them, right? So it's like, it's a very, very different way of thinking. And then once you kind of shift to that, you're like, oh, wow, there's so much that could be happening in terms of adaptation inside the body, how cells are actually evolving inside the body over the course of our lifetimes. And that shift just opens up, all this potential for using evolutionary approaches and adaptationist thinking to generate hypotheses that then you can test. So I don't know how much you guys talk about adaptationism on the podcast, but like the basic idea. Yeah. Should I say what the basic idea of it is?
It might be the first time we've said that word on the show. It's possible.
Oh, wow. Amazing. Okay. Yeah. So adaptationism is basically this idea that you can look at sort of the world through this lens of what's the function of things, of, like if an organism has some physical or behavioral, characteristics, what is the function of that? And it's a way of kind of, bringing in an evolutionary perspective where you're kind of thinking of things as like, as if there's a purpose. So you actually kind of use some of this language earlier of like, bacteria are trying to survive. Well, they're not like, oh, how do I do this inside the body, right? But they like behave as if they are, right? And so, one of the ways that you can kind of think of adaptationism is this like, you're looking at what's happening as if it is with the purpose of surviving or reproducing. And so when you take that lens, thinking about cells in the body, that come from the lineage that, originated with the conceptus that was us, right? It really starts to change things and opens up all these possibilities for evolutionary and ecological processes that could be going on inside the body over the course of our lifetimes.
Yeah. I think one thing that makes it less natural to think about cancer this way is that, of course, we know that the endpoint of cancer is the death of the organism that hosts it and the death of the cancer itself. But, of course, evolution has no foresight. This is the kind of thing you've always got to remember, that there's nothing that stops evolution from driving an organism to extinction, as long as at every step the changes are good for the individuals that host them. Maybe that's a little bit extreme. And in fact, maybe that leads very nicely to the next question, which is, so go back half a billion years or so, give or take. Until then, it's all been kind of individual cells, but these cells are maybe trying, or there's evolutionary pressure for them to get the benefits of being larger and having multiple cells and specialization if they can make it work. But how on earth do they make it work? Because once you have multicellular organisms, then they're always at risk of being undermined from within by any individual cell that defects from the interests of the organism as a whole, even just in the short run, and then brings the whole project crashing down by becoming cancerous, basically. I remember when I was studying evolution at university, there was this discussion of group selection among humans. So you could have a question of, is it possible for humans to evolve altruism and cooperativeness because, say, groups of humans in the past that were more cooperative tended to thrive more and reproduce more. And so, the individuals who had that attitude would then become more numerous. I think in general, evolutionary theorists, at least back when I was at university, didn't really like this idea because it suffers from this problem that any group of cooperators can then be really easily undermined by a cheat who is able to fool everyone else and take advantage of the group and then bring the whole cooperative system of the group, undermine it and then make it not work. So I'm kind of wondering, why doesn't multicellular life suffer from that same fatal issue?
I have so much to say about this. So, first pass is multicellular life does suffer from this very issue cancer is a problem for all multicellular life. Somewhere between 30 and 50% of people, get cancer by the end of their lives. So it is a problem. Now, I think thinking has shifted a little bit in the last few decades around, these ideas of group selection. And I have always kind of been like an advocate for using like multi-level selection as the language, because I think that the idea of group selection, or the phrasing of group selection, has been kind of like almost a political issue within like evolutionary biology, with people being like, oh, I'm a group selectionist or I'm not, right? So it's been sort of like almost like a marker of coalitional identity more than anything else. And the fact is, you can always get natural selection to act in situations that meet the criteria for natural selection. And there are situations where groups can meet those criteria. And so if you're in a situation where those criteria are met, then you should say, yes, group selection can happen when, you have heritability and you have, differential fitness, and when you have situations where those criteria are met, you should just say, yeah, we'll have, you can have selection acting on that level. One way of looking at, what happened in the transition to multicellularity is that you basically shifted, from situations where you had, individual cells getting selected to having groups of cells getting selected. So you could say, that actually was, group selection, or is continuing to be group selection, in that we're made of 30 trillion cells that are cooperating and coordinating to make us viable. I think that, the way that a lot of people have sort of framed this in order to kind of stick with the sort of like individual level kind of analysis and individual level mathematical analysis is to say, there's a transition in individuality where you go from, it being individual cells to now being organisms that are getting selected in their own right. And that's absolutely a legitimate way to look at it as well. But all of this is really a matter of what assumptions you're making about, what constitutes a group versus what constitutes an individual. When you want to make that, mental or mathematical leap from what you're saying is a unit or not. So I'm pretty pluralistic about this. I think, just like sort of open, talking about how like all the laws of physics apply, like at all scales, but in some, some apply more than others just because you're dealing with different kinds of entities. I think that's the case with a lot of the, mathematical and conceptual models around the evolution of cooperation, that, some apply more at some levels than others. And that it's useful to have many of these tools kind of in your toolkit to be able to use in the right context. And multi-level selection, I think, is one of the ones that's like a little bit more general, because you can, be like, oh, this is a situation where the selection pressures are greater between groups because you have more variation between groups than within them, for example, right? So I think that it's a more broadly useful framework.
Yeah. I guess we could see from the result that multicellular life exists, that basically evolutionarily this challenge was overcome, and it was overcome by the creation of the immune system, basically, by all of these sentinels, or all of these processes going on within a multicellular organism that are constantly monitoring each cell, or like most cells, to see whether they're acting suspicious, and then to try to put a stop to it if they seem like they're not coordinating properly with the group. And it's by investing lots of effort in that multicellular life has become viable, basically. Is that right?
Yeah, I would just add, it's not just the sort of, immune system. We have really 3 different levels on which you have monitoring and responses to cellular cheating. So the first one, I would, start with the cellular intrinsic mechanisms, i.e. what the cell is doing on the inside to monitor what genes are being expressed, what proteins are being produced, what the cell is doing in terms of its physiology. Genes like TP53, they're basically like listening in on like all the stuff that the cell is doing from the inside. And if it seems like the cell is maybe, doing things it shouldn't be doing, then it, raises an alarm. And, initially, like that alarm halts the cell cycle, starts engaging the DNA repair process. And if that doesn't work, then it's like, you know what, we're just gonna, so that we don't mess things up for everybody else. So it's kind of like the cellular conscience. Like you could think of it that way if we're gonna,
I see.
like that's one set of mechanisms. And, TP53 is not the only one. There's many, many, genetically based systems inside the cell that are monitoring the behavior of that cell and changing the state of that cell, right, to do DNA repair, halting cell cycle, engaging, cellular death. All of those things are options, to keep the cells from making a problem for the rest of the body. So you have that level. And then you have the neighborhood level. So cells are constantly monitoring each other and constantly sending signals to each other. They're sending survival signals and anti-apoptosis signals, right? So
apoptosis
basically
is cell suicide.
Yeah. So, and sending growth signals as well. So basically, the survival signals, those anti-apoptosis survival signals are basically saying, cell, you're good, hang in there with us. And then the growth signals are saying, you can keep dividing, everything's all good, in my opinion, with you, right? So again, anthropomorphizing, but it's useful, I think, because, these same kinds of processes, there's elements of that happen, across all systems.
If you don't use this language of intent and purpose, I feel like the sentences just become so absurdly convoluted. It's such a slicker way of thinking about it. Although I guess you have to have all of these red flags go off when you're doing it wrong or doing it in a way that's where the evolution wouldn't actually cause it. But sorry, go on.
Yeah. So you've got those two levels, and then you have also the systemic level, which you were referring to earlier, where you have this sort of broader system that's monitoring the body for like regions where maybe something isn't right, and it's a really good backup system for those other systems that we already talked about, and it also plays a broader role in just sort of like looking at if there's bacteria or viruses that shouldn't be there. But even like the cell intrinsic system and the neighborhood systems, they're not just monitoring sort of for these sort of internal things in the cell, they're also sort of monitoring for viruses and stuff like that too. So there's overlap in terms of some of these mechanisms that are there just to sort of protect us from things that might be trying to hijack us or undermine the broader evolutionary interests of the whole organism. So
an interesting thing that I hadn't really, I guess I'd heard of contagious cancer before, but I'd never really thought about it before this book. But if you think about it in the abstract, it is kind of weird that cancer can't be contagious, because in as much as one person has these cells that are refusing to get shut down and are just proliferating as much as possible, if they got into someone else's body, then or another body of the same species or possibly even a different species, then why wouldn't they proliferate as well? And basically the answer is the same as the reason why it's difficult for pathogenic bacteria or viruses to do it, that we have all of these systems in order to make sure that can't happen. But in the very early days of multicellular life, this was a massive challenge before organisms, I guess, had figured out how to prevent contagious cancer so effectively. But the funny thing is that it seems like with viruses and bacteria, we're constantly in this difficult arms race. It feels like it's a bit of an even fight between us and these various other pathogens, between our immune system evolving and improving and them trying to work to get around it. But with contagious cancer, with most organisms, it feels like the immune system has just done such a good job that we very rarely see contagious cancer. We only see it in unusual cases like Tasmanian devils, where they have very low genetic diversity, and they also spread the cancer by literally biting wounds into other individuals. And then, as we'll discuss later, wound healing releases growth hormones that then are conducive to cancer production. But
as an aside, I just have to point out, like, if there is a species in which like a zombie apocalypse is going on, right? It's the Tasmanian devils. They're biting each other's faces and spreading contagious cancer. I mean,
Does the cancer make them more vicious and cause them to bite more?
There's
them
a
mad.
hypothesis that that the cancer actually is affecting aspects of their behavior, including also their reproductive behavior. So I don't know this literature that well, but there's definitely some interest in it, and I have a grad student who's intrigued by this as well. So maybe we'll.
Nice.
Maybe
Yeah,
we'll
that seems like this seems like a full zombie apocalypse.
Yeah,
Brilliant.
exactly. Right. Yeah.
Sorry, it's terrible. It's tragic, but
it is.
Anyway.
It is. We have to. I mean, but that's the thing. It's like we have to approach all of these terrible things with a little bit of humor. Otherwise, how are we going to, keep working on them? So
very true.
Yeah.
But yeah, why do you think that we've mostly successfully beaten contagious cancer, but not so much bacteria and viruses and sometimes fungi?
So I think that one of the things that's actually missing from the way that a lot of people think about cancer, especially in, sort of oncology and cancer biology, is this window of what was going on very early in multicellularity, which, you made a reference to. But, if you consider, the early stages where you've got some groups of cells and they're growing and they're producing public goods that are good for all of the cells in there. And if you get a cell coming from this other group and popping in there, it can get the benefits of what that other group has created. It's just it's a free rider problem, a common pool resource problem. It's the sort of classic kind of issue, and I think, the very evolution of multicellularity is not just about regulating the cooperation within an entity that is, beginning and might evolve, that cheating, but the early evolution of multicellularity was the evolution of prevention of contagious cancer. I think we should be thinking about that as one of the fundamental things that was going on in the early stages of multicellularity. And so a lot of these systems that we have that, are part of our immune system have their, many of their origins in that original selection pressure in one way or another, or at least that's where we need to kind of start when we think about what kinds of mechanisms might have evolved. That adaptive problem of, cells just popping in and trying to get the benefits of that entity. So many of our cancer suppression systems could potentially originally have been in place for prevention of contagious cancer. Right?
Yeah.
It's an open question, what of our cancer, prevention mechanisms have to do with that versus having to do with the maybe the more modern problem of, preventing cancer from the inside as opposed to that hijacking from the outside.
I'm seeing some academic politics going on there. How can that be an open question? Surely we can just theorize about this and kind of tell that it sort of has to be true, unless all of the mechanisms that we originally designed 500 million years ago to prevent cheating cancer have subsequently all disappeared and been replaced by something else.
So, Rob, when you are working in an area where you're applying new theoretical frameworks, you're bringing things together, there are many places where you start to question the assumptions that are out there about how things work. And, sometimes there are a lot of really good reasons for those assumptions. Other times they're not. I think we're kind of on the same page of I like to be okay, first principles, this is what we should assume. It's almost like a Bayesian kind of thing. Coming from first principles, here's what I think a reasonable assumption is. But I think that, it's important
it's hard to prove.
So it's important to acknowledge, right, that there's a community of researchers who, have been working with a particular frame, have made progress on problems with a particular frame. And so I think that it's a good thing to frame it as this is a hypothesis that comes from these first principles. It makes some predictions that could be tested, and encouraging people to
do that.
Yeah, because I can't do that's the other thing is like I can't test all of the hypotheses myself that come from this, and so it makes much more sense to it's like an opportunity for us to consider an alternative hypothesis based on evolutionary first principles.
Totally. Okay, sorry. Yeah, I interrupted you there. I think we're heading towards why is the anti-cancer why are our anti-contagious cancer mechanisms so successful? Maybe relative to our ability to stop other pathogens.
Yeah, right. So a lot of that I think is because the very evolution of multicellularity required that that occur, and also the kinds of threats that you could have from a human cell that is trying to hijack a human body are specific in a way that you could get specific anti-cancer mechanisms evolving for. Versus if we're thinking about, pathogens, we're thinking about viruses and, bacteria and, fungi, right? You have so many different species, so many different mechanisms of action. And so you can't just have, you have to get evolution on every one of those specific kinds of potential risks or some general purpose systems, which we have as well, but I think that it's worth that perspective. It's not just like human cells versus pathogens. It's like human cells as one kind of thing that could be an infection. Okay, so one way I might rephrase that is kind of every contagious cancer has to start from its starting point is a healthy human cell, and then it's got to modify from there. And that's like a very limited design choice. Whereas if you're talking about viruses and bacteria, they've got a very blank canvas on which they can write any possible infectious behavior or life cycle or so on. And I guess maybe also human cancer cells, they reproduce unusually fast relative to our normal cells because they try to avoid or they try to evade the limits on reproduction. But they're not replicating and evolving quite as fast as viruses and bacteria potentially can, because I guess they're even smaller and they just have a faster life cycle. Is that generally right? There's certainly, viruses, right? Like if they're inside a cell, they can replicate like crazy. Cancer cells, I think, the current thinking is that, they, can reproduce as quickly as, 24 hours or a little less. So they can get pretty fast. But you're absolutely right that there's just a much broader canvas on which to paint if you consider all of the potential pathogens that are out there in the world. And so, but also, we need to recognize that like there's a pretty big repertoire that cancer cells can access as well, because our genomes have a lot of things that can be messed with to, make these cells that do things that are evolutionarily unprecedented, at least for like what a cell in a multicellular body should do.
Yeah, so by having a much larger genome than a bacteria, it can potentially have much more complicated capacities. And also, it's like, of course, a human cell is kind of ideally already situated to live in a human body in a way that a bacteria might not be. So it does have that sort of leg up. But I guess evidently it's turned out to just balance out into being, usually it's easier to prevent contagious cancer than contagious bacteria. But do plants and fungi get cancer as well as animals?
It all comes down to how you're defining cancer. Yeah. So there's like, or sort of like, there's some like politics about that, right? Like, academic politics, right? So some people are like, oh, you can't call that cancer. But if you're asking, do you get disruptions in cell proliferation and apoptosis and differentiation of cells, right? The division of labor, like all those things. The answer is yes. Essentially any multicellular lineage that you look at, you see examples of at least, what we could call cancer-like phenomena where, cells are proliferating when they shouldn't, for the sort of, survival or reproduction of the organism, and where, you can have disruption of the division of labor of the, differentiation of the cells.
So I've known people who've said, oh, unfortunately, my pet has cancer, it's going to die. I've never known anyone who said my houseplant has cancer and unfortunately it's dying. In what ways is plant or fungi cancer different than that in animals? And it seems like on balance, it's a bit less visible or like less of a big deal.
Yeah. So there's actually one of the things that happened like early on in my like interest in cancer was that I actually came here to Arizona before I lived here and saw a crested saguaro cactus. Now, this is a pretty awesome thing. There's a decent number of them around here. Where rather than having like a that sort of classic shape, right, where they have like one or a few, right, kind of trunks coming out. You get this like crown kind of on the top. It just like fans out. It's beautiful. And I was like, wow, that is, that really is like a plant cancer. You have this disruption in the growth. And when I looked into the physiology of it, you basically have a situation where, the growth tip, like, on the tip of any plant that's growing, it's usually a few cells that are, they're called meristem cells, or basically like the plant equivalent of stem cells. And as they proliferate, they create like, a sort of linear thing. But you can get a disruption where rather than like just a few cells in a little clump, you have some cells in a line. And then what ends up happening is as those cells are all proliferating, they start to kind of like, fan out, and you get like, all these almost like brain-like patterns or crown-like patterns. And so in a way, with fasciation, it's called fasciation, it's almost more visible. You can see it. You can envision a little bit more like, well, what is going on with cell proliferation when you have these disruptions? Just because the physiology of plants, you don't have stem cells just stuck inside all of the tissues. They're kind of at the ends, right? So I think it's a really cool lens to think about, like what happens with cancer. And they're also, because they're structurally beautiful, really. It's a way that I think we can engage with cancer that is emotionally more accessible and just has a framing that I think for a lot of people feels more inviting than other ways of thinking about cancer. And we actually created a garden here with crested cacti to kind of teach about how cancer is this phenomenon that exists across life, and also kind of cultivating it as a space for people to go to remember people who've been affected by cancer, and using it as a way of thinking about how can we live with cancer as opposed to just like fighting it. So so I love plant cancers and what they do for us on so many levels in terms of thinking about like what cancer is, how it manifests, and with plants a lot of times they can survive with these fasciations. They're more vulnerable often than plants that don't have fasciations, but if they're taken care of, they can thrive. And so there's just a lot of like nice metaphors there, right, for thinking about how we can deal with cancer differently.
Yeah, because I used to say this very stupid. Well, this now sounds incredibly stupid to me, but I used to say that kind of plants don't get cancer because plants are cancer. And I think what I meant by that is that plants have a very flexible body structure, which allows them to absorb, I guess, tumors or cancerous behavior in a more elegant way where it's less fatal to them. Or like more often you just, that they could just grow off in some direction, and that doesn't necessarily kill the entire organism. And a plant can just like let go of part of its body, potentially kill off a particular trunk, and then carry on if it's not working out. Is that kind of the reason why it seems like plants die less often of cancer? I mean, you're saying 30 to 50% of people will have cancer by the time they die. It doesn't seem like 30 to 50% of wheat stalks have cancer problems by the time we're harvesting them. I suppose maybe with plants that are that short-lived, it's just like they haven't been around for long enough. But what about old trees? We don't see old trees dying this way, and I imagine it's something to do with the fact that cells move around less within plants. They don't have as much of an aggressive circulatory system, and maybe also just that they can absorb the damage more flexibly.
Yeah. So plants, totally awesome, right? Like they're just so cool, and we, I think a lot of times we sort of are, not just anthropocentric in terms of thinking about like how the rest of life works, but like mammalian centric. And, a lot of plants, there's a huge amount of genetic diversity that exists like within them, right? Like different branches will be like really genetically different. You can have fruits that are genetically different from each other. And you can get, this process of natural selection really happening even like within a plant, with different branches thriving versus others. And and then like dropping branches, and sometimes those can actually grow into new trees. I mean, the biology is just really different. Yeah, it's so different from what our sort of assumptions are as these, like honestly not very resilient organisms that we are. We think we're so awesome, but like, I mean, with the exception of like some, fanciful Marvel movies, like we can't even regenerate a limb, like it's we're kind of pathetic. Like, yeah, it is. It's embarrassing. Yeah. So, but yeah, I think that, that broader frame of, just thinking about, well, how does life, solve these various problems? How does life, adapt, during, like, how do some organisms adapt during their lifetimes, like actually genetically adapt, not just behaviorally adapt? I think that expanding that frame is not just like really important for how we look at and think about biology, but it's also really fun to like know these things, right? To like be like, oh wow, yeah, that that plant is got all of these unique mutations in different branches potentially that could lead to differential survival and reproduction. It blows my mind. And of course, many, like, it's not like all plants are the same. Like there's all sorts of different ways that different plants work and different ways that their reproductive systems work. And so yeah, there is so much. And I'm no plant expert. I'm just a fan.
So, yeah, another fascinating thing in the book, elephants have way more cells than humans, and no surprise there. I think it's like 100 times as much or something. And yet they get deadly cancers less often than we do. And then that's super counterintuitive on its face, because you'd think that the probability of you developing a seriously dangerous cancerous tumor would be roughly proportional to just the total number of cells you have, because each one of them has an opportunity to itself become cancerous. Yeah, why is it that elephants don't get cancer much more than humans?
That's a great question. And, again, we have to think about definitions here, right? So, because a lot of elephants actually have growths, have tumors. They're just not, metastatic and cancerous, and they don't, threaten their lives so much. But to kind of get back to your main question about, why is, an elephant less likely to die of cancer than we are or than a mouse is, right? That's a big contrast. And that, to think about sort of, those big picture issues, we have to consider that there's different selection pressures on organisms that are long-lived and large versus short lived and small. And long-lived large organisms, they have to invest a lot more in what we call somatic maintenance, which is just like a fancy way of saying like fixing your body and making sure that like the body maintains itself well. So in order to have a chance at reproduction, a large long-lived organism needs to be doing a lot more, cellular things to take care of the body, including DNA repair, monitoring for cellular cheating and all of that. So organisms that are larger and longer lived, more robust cancer suppression mechanisms than organisms that are smaller and shorter lived. And this ties in with an idea in evolutionary biology called life history theory, whereas basically...
Can you explain that for a bit?
Yeah, sure. So you've probably heard the phrase like live fast, die young, right? Like it's it's something that's kind of part of our collective consciousness, right? There's this idea that you can kind of like have a strategy of, like living for a long time and living slower, or you could like live fast and potentially burn out.
Not plan for the long term.
Yeah, that's right. And so there's a sort of version of this that just applies to like all life that evolves, which is that organisms in general have trade-offs between surviving and, taking care of their bodies, maintaining their bodies, and reproducing. And so depending on whether an organism is prioritizing survival or reproduction, that's going to change how their physiology and behavior manifests, and it can have a lot of knock-on effects then that are self-reinforcing, right? So basically, a mouse is a fast life history strategist, we would say. Yeah, it's invests in becoming reproductive quickly, having lots of offspring, and doesn't invest a lot in its soma, in its body, in things like cancer suppression. An elephant, on the other hand, grows big, grows relatively slowly, has fewer offspring, but invests a lot more in each of them, and does a lot more somatic maintenance, does a lot more taking care of the body itself, which is necessary if you're going to be able to stick around long enough to successfully reproduce if you're a slow life history organism.
Yeah. I kind of like to picture life history study. I'm imagining evolution kind of embodied in these engineers or something who are standing around kind of chatting about the animals they're going to design. And one of them's like, I got this great idea. It's going to be called an elephant. It's going to be massive. It's going to be this huge organism. It's going to have no predators because nothing's going to be able to eat it or beat it. And it's going to be able to reach up really high in the trees, get all this energy. Imagine another engineer being like, that's never going to work. It's going to have way too many cells. It's going to have cancers all the time. What are you thinking? You're an idiot. And the other engineer says, no, I've thought about this. What we're going to do is we're going to invest a ton. Okay, yeah, all right. It's got all these benefits. And what we're going to get is we're going to invest a ton of energy and molecules in making sure it doesn't get cancer. So we're going to have real tripwires everywhere. So any cell that seems to be acting out, we're gonna shut it down right away. And okay, this is gonna slow down the growth. We're gonna have to. It's gonna have an overhead, all right. But at the end of the day, we're gonna have this massive elephant. It's gonna live for ages. It'll be able to have lots of babies because it will live long enough. You can imagine, yeah. And then you could do the opposite with a mouse, basically. We're like, okay, forget it. We're not gonna worry about the body. It's just gonna replicate like crazy. Is this basically the idea?
I love this. And I mean, you're just like being like the adaptationist engineer right now. You're like, all right, how are we going to design this thing for this function or that function? And I think it's a great cognitive tool to use to just like wrap our minds around like how are things going to evolve given constraints, and what kinds of adaptations would we expect given that you want an organism to be able to do this thing or that thing, right? So I think the engineering metaphors are right on for thinking about how do organisms evolve to maximize that combination of survival and reproduction that that whatever that combination is that they're sort of aiming for or choosing. Again, I'm using scare quotes just because we're using this like as if intentionality as a shortcut for thinking and talking about something that is a long, complicated process of natural selection acting on all of these mechanisms, but we can use this cognitive shortcut as long as we acknowledge it's a cognitive shortcut. So
yeah, I just remembered in our annual feedback for the show, there's one person who wrote in their feedback, everything Rob says about evolution on the show is wrong. Unfortunately, they didn't elaborate on that, so I don't know. I can only imagine this poor soul is just hating this episode. If you manage to stick with it long enough, please email me and tell me what I've been saying wrong about evolution on the show. I would. I was very curious. Anyway, continuing with maybe wrong things. What is the?
I think we're pretty good. We just need like the right caveats in there. So I think we're good. I guess I slightly went over quickly what the downside is of having this slow life history strategy and these and like a very large scale. But I guess so. One thing is if you're gonna lower massively the probability that each cell becomes a cancerous or dangerous tumor, which you have to do if you're going to have lots of cells, then you literally just have to invest in a lot more proteins to do the monitoring. You have to do a lot more double checking every time you duplicate the genome to make sure that even fewer errors are getting through. Are there other downsides like that people should be aware of? Other than the sort of like cellular bureaucracy that you have to deal with, like if you're an elephant, it's like, oh, can I do this,
it's
please?
Like this Byzantine, it's like this Byzantine thing that you have to go through to get permission to do anything. Yeah,
I submitted the request 3 weeks ago. What's going on? Can I please divide now? Yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of trade-offs. I mean, like one of the basic principles of sort of like thinking in evolutionary terms is that there are going to be trade-offs. If you want to divide quickly, then you have to deal with the potential of having more mutations, right? And so then if you don't want to have that trade-off, like you can be stuck up against the fact that, well, there's actually physical constraints to if you're going to divide and check the DNA, that takes actual time, right?
Yeah.
So yes, you can make more, proteins that monitor things. You can, even try to get as much friction out of the system as possible. But eventually, there are some trade-offs that you just can't escape once you get to a certain point when a lot of things have already sort of been optimized in terms of, getting those systems functioning efficiently.
Yeah. So one time that you need to have cells divide quickly is when you sustain an injury, say a skin injury, and you need to grow that back. Or I suppose like our intestines are constantly sustaining a bit of damage, and they have to really have pretty rapid cell turnover in order to fix that because they're just exposed to a lot of tough situations.
Yeah.
Is it the case that elephants, if they sustain a cut, the cut doesn't grow back so quickly, or maybe their cell turnover within their stomachs and intestines isn't as good as it is for humans?
Yeah, so I'm not sure how systematically that has been measured in elephants, but there is a general set of trade-offs with, for example, wound healing and cell turnover and cancer susceptibility. So anytime you have a cellular system that so if we think of an organism that can heal a wound quickly, right? What's going on there? Well, the process of wound healing requires cells to be proliferating quickly and to be moving to close that wound. And it's good to be able to do those things quickly, right? Because if you don't, you're more likely to get an infection. You're more likely to, have your ability to do things impacted, right? If you heal less quickly. So there's a lot of benefits to being able to close a wound more, rapidly than not. But if you do that, you also have cells that are, more likely to be on a hair trigger for increasing their proliferation and moving if the environment is like suggests that there's a wound. And so, one of the things that you actually sometimes see in tumors is that the physiology inside the tumor kind of looks like a wound that doesn't heal. We have like a set of buttons, the levers, right, that can kind of get pushed, and that leaves us susceptible to cancer. And so, the more rapidly your wounds can heal, potentially the more susceptible, those organisms will be to cancer because the cells are, sort of erring on the side of being able to heal wounds quickly so that they, are less likely to die of infection and less likely to have functionality impacted for as long.
Yeah, one thing we maybe skipped over a little bit quickly is with a mouse, say, it could invest more effort in, ensuring that there's no mutations in its genome when its cells replicate. And that would have a long-term benefit where potentially for then, as long as the organism lives, it has avoided those mutations. The problem is, as a mouse, your odds of being predated, your odds of being killed in the environment are really high. So why would you want to be planning for years ahead when you're unlikely to survive that long anyway? Or at least the odds are far lower for a mouse than an elephant. And that fact that you might well die of other reasons anyway, so let's not think about the long term, that then greatly reduces the evolutionary pressure in favor of maintaining, building, ramping up these anti-cancer measures because they just don't carry as much importance because you'll probably be dead before too long regardless.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's a really important part of life history theory, which is, what are the selection pressures, right, that make it more likely that an organism is going to evolve to be a fast life history strategist versus a slow life history strategist. And having what's called, high extrinsic mortality, right? Like having the chance that you will die from something random in the environment. If that's high, then the organisms will evolve to invest less in somatic maintenance because it could just be gone like that. So, versus situations where the resources are a little bit more stable, then you get selection for slow life history strategies.
Yeah. So yeah, I think we've now done enough background to ask this question. There's a whole lot of people who are working on trying to extend human life and slow down aging. And I guess as part of that, they're going to want to ramp up these mechanisms, these anti-cancer mechanisms that we have, in order to prevent us from developing these cheating cells that create problems. And potentially, I think there are avenues to do that. There are people that thinking about, like, are there drugs that we can do to basically ramp up these to give greater intensity to these existing processes that we have to try to prevent cancer. But it sounds like in so doing, we would produce some problems. For example, if we did manage to try to reduce aging and extend human lifespan this way, would our injuries heal less quickly? And would we have to be more careful about anything that went wrong in our intestines, because the cell turnover wouldn't be what it was? Yeah,
there's potentially a lot of inadvertent trade-offs that could arise. There's also, a sort of tough bind of, like, if you want to extend life by reducing the risk of cancer and you interfere with things like cell proliferation and, the sort of rejuvenation of tissues that stem cells help us do, right? It's like, well, how do you have your evolutionary cake and eat it too? How do you both, like, make sure that the organism is, renewing itself properly, while at the same time not allowing that renewal capacity to get hijacked by, agents that could. Yeah. So, and this is part of why, cancer is such a tricky problem, is because you run up against all of these trade-offs. And, if you think you've got it, like, cornered over here, but then, you've got, like, all these things happening over here. So you're like, oh, wait, no, I got to get over here. So it is a slippery thing to think of, okay, well, how would we eliminate cancer? And what would we lose if we tried to eliminate cancer, right? So there are a lot of trade-offs, and we're not going to get around that, because cancer is a susceptibility that is just built in to being a multicellular organism. We can evolve a lot of mechanisms to detect it, to respond to it, and those systems can evolve to be pretty good in terms of the efficiency and reducing side effects and trade-offs and things like that, but. There are fundamental trade-offs that we just can't escape. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to suggest that there's no way that humans could be better from our well-being point of view. Because, I mean, to start with, elephants exist. They have a much lower rate of cancer per cell than we do, or at least dangerous cancer per cell than we do. And they are a functional organism. So there are directions that you can go here that aren't an engineering dead end. I suppose it's just that we probably would face some other trade-offs, and we might have to try to compensate for the problems that we might be creating elsewhere. I suppose if you were trying to do this from birth, then one issue that we haven't talked about is that you might grow a whole lot slower, because a baby growing is closer. It's like its cells are behaving more closely to cancer than an adult's cells when they're just in maintenance, because of course they're proliferating all the time. The message is get bigger. Yeah. I mean, the better a job that you want to do at sort of avoiding these trade-offs, also the more complex all the systems have to be, which then in itself creates vulnerabilities for the system to be more hijackable. So, like there is a lot that can potentially be done, but, like how good are we going to be at anticipating what the, side effects are going to be, and, making sure that those are trade-offs that we want to make for ourselves or for, the next generation. I think, there are a lot of issues that we definitely should be thinking about and grappling with, when we think about, when we think about cancer and the future of cancer, because it's not as simple as just, oh, what's the magic bullet to make cancer go away?
Less cancer signal.
Right. Yeah.
So a new theme, because cancer cells, they're cheats by nature. They're cheating on the cells around them in the organism that they're a part of. But that presents them with a problem that how do they coordinate among themselves? Is it possible to maintain honor among thieves, so to speak? To what extent do cancer cells figure out a way to cooperate among themselves, or are they all kind of stabbing one another in the back as well?
Well, anytime you have the conditions that will select for cooperation, like you can get the evolution of cooperation. And so, yeah, on a first pass, we can think of cancer cells as cellular cheaters. But, if they're in a situation where, they can produce growth factors, not just for themselves, but for their neighbors, then, especially if you have, clones, right? You have the same genetic lineage, very easy to evolve, this sort of cooperative trait of producing growth factors that, promote the growth of the cells around as well. You can also get, division of labor, right? Like some cells specializing in producing growth factors, other cells specializing in evading the immune system, even other cells specializing in reproduction, right? So there's certain kinds of cancer cells. We call them cancer stem cells because they, they're the ones that replicate, and there's a lot of cancer cells that don't. And one potential explanation for why that is the case is because you have a sort of proto-multicellularity almost going on where, some cells can be specializing in the reproduction side of things and other cells can be specializing in, doing all of the things to help that little, cluster of proto-multicellular cancer protoplasm to, get around and replicate. So it's, I think
once you have a cancer, though, that has developed this level of cooperation, so cancer cells are kind of always one step away from wanting to defect on the cells around them because kind of their nature. What does it look like when cancer gets cancer? And like, does that happen very much?
Yeah, well, so this is sort of the, idea that like you can have like a hyper cancer or like a meta cancer, right? And I think, in practice, anytime that you have cooperation, say you have a cluster of cells that are all, producing growth factors, if you get a mutant that stops producing that growth factor, they can potentially gain an advantage as long as they're in an environment where growth factors are being produced, right? So, so whether or not you get the evolution of cheating, or the extended evolution of cheating is going to be dependent on, being able to sort of maintain a population of entities that you can keep exploiting. So there's, I think there are some barriers to like, cancer cells even kind of getting to the point where you would have the evolution of sort of like hypertumors or hypercancers, just because constantly sort of at every stage, you have cheaters that like, emerge and are sort of getting purged because of the population structure or, other factors. Yeah, because I mean, the thing is like, yes, within any group, right, the cheaters are going to do better than the others in the group. But once you expand your frame and you realize, oh, there are multiple groups, this is like a meta population. Some groups are more stable than others, right? And the groups that are more stable than others tend to be the ones that are more cooperative. Then, that actually really changes the dynamics a lot and makes it so that cooperation can be favored. So
on this model, you'd expect a tumor to grow and then kind of collapse as it's undermined from within, but then another tumor to grow because they figured out that they're still cooperating for now, and so they take over, and it will be like quite a dynamic situation. Is that accurate? So
you can get dynamics like that happening with the blood supply to tumors. So basically, the cells can be signaling, for more resources, and sort of opening up the taps, right, from the circulatory system. Yeah. And, and as that happens, actually, it's very similar to what, like a irrigation system where the upstream individuals, if they open up the taps all the way, they're depriving the downstream individuals. And, actually, you can also get the collapse of the sort of infrastructure because if all the taps are opened up, then you don't have enough pressure inside the vessels to maintain the flow. So, you can get this sort of like, collapse, this like civilizational collapse, right? Because of basically exploiting of the commons. There's like not a good resource regulation set of mechanisms there. So that kind of dynamic does happen. And but there are a lot of other places where you can get the evolution of cooperation and cheating. And honestly, to me, the scariest thing about cancer is the cooperation side. And I think that we've talked a little bit about this, kind of like working from first principles to, make some predictions. And I think if we look at this from a first principles kind of perspective, it's quite likely that, early on in, the dissemination of cancer. So, you have a primary tumor, but then you can get metastasis, right? Which is the real problem in cancer usually, right? It's the, systemic dissemination of these cells. I think it's quite likely that by the time you have a metastasis that, is visible in, any sort of screening, that very often, that might have really come from a long lineage of, clusters of cancer cells that were sort of selected on the basis of being already able to cooperate effectively in order to extract resources, reproduce, and move. So, my colleagues and I have written about this some, and I wrote some about this in my book. But I think it's one of the sort of most neglected but most important evolutionary dynamics and evolutionary processes that is going on in cancer, potentially going on in cancer. So, when we look at metastasis, we might be looking at something that is actually the result of, many, many, many generations of selection on group level phenotypes of cancer cells already. So that's something that I think
it's a very evolved beast.
So I think that requires a lot more attention. That possibility requires a lot more attention than it has had up until this point, because it has very different implications for how we might be treating metastasis, right? If it is the result of many generations of selection on a collective phenotype or set of collective phenotypes.
Yeah. One really mind-blowing thing in the book is I remember I was on the tube when I was listening to this, and I thought I knew the answer to it, and then I was completely wrong. So basically, you set up in the book that we have this gene and this, like, I guess, set of processes that will call, I guess, the TP53 gene, which collects a lot of information about what's going on in the cell and in the local environment in order to decide whether the cell should commit suicide. And so it's trying to look for funny business and see, if A is wrong and like B is triggered and there's also like X, then okay, then we're going to shut down this cell. We got to shut this down because it's too high a risk that I've become cancerous now. Now, the interesting thing is that because so much work is being done by this one TP53 gene, protein, and general system, that creates a single point of failure where if you have a really destructive mutation in the TP53 gene such that it cannot function anymore, then your chances of that cell becoming cancerous go way up. And so you might think, why wouldn't you have a more robust system where rather than put so many of your eggs in one basket, why not have lots of different processes going on at the same time, all independently deciding whether something has gone wrong and the cell should commit suicide / apoptose? Now think about audience, like why do you think it is that the cell puts so many eggs in one basket?
So two things. So one thing is there are a lot of there are many different processes that are all sort of going on. It's not just TP53, but it is the case that, like you said, all of this information is kind of flowing through, TP53. And that's the case for many of these other systems where, there is sort of one point where if you break that point, then the whole system can get messed up. And so then the question is why have that sort of, why have everything flowing in to one spot and then flowing out? And One potential explanation for why this is the case is that, in order for a cell to really sort of figure out if there's a problem or not with the cellular behavior, it needs to integrate information from many, many different sources. So, for example, earlier we were talking about, wound healing, right? So, it would be important to know, right, if the reason that the cell is proliferating and moving has to do with being in an environment where that's actually what is beneficial for the organism, right? Is this a wound healing situation, or is it not? And in order to be able to integrate information from all of those different sources, at some point it all has to come together. And so you can potentially have, these sort of points of vulnerability because you need to integrate information across a lot of different domains, I guess you could say, in order to actually sort of make a smart decision, in scare quotes, right? So because it has a very different meaning, right? You could say for a cell to be proliferating and moving if it's in a wound healing environment versus if it's in a normal tissue environment. So the downstream consequence of what should happen is going to be different in those two cases.
Yeah. Maybe an analogy would be if you had a really big company and the CEO, say, at the end of the year has to decide, should this company expand or should we make layoffs? Should we be growing or shrinking? You might think, well, that creates this single point of failure where, if the CEO has bad judgment, then this is going to really mess things up. Why don't we have two different people who'll each only look at half of the information from the organization? and then if either one of them thinks we should expand, then we'll expand. And you can immediately see the problem there, that if they're doing this stuff independently and they're relying on different information rather than just duplicating it, then they're blind to half of what's going on. And that's going to potentially make their decision-making a lot faultier.
Yeah.
Yeah. But elephants have lots of redundant copies of this TP53 gene or something like that, right?
Yeah, some of them are not functional, but so you can get, genomes with multiple CEOs, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
But then the question is, what happens with those over evolutionary time? Do they continue to process the same information? Do they differentiate into, processing sort of different streams of information? And I like thinking about it in these sort of information processing terms more generally, because, I think that we tend to sort of look at the cells in our body as like, they're just like, blobs of biological stuff. But actually, they're computational systems that are taking in, huge amounts of complex information, processing it, and then changing, gene expression as a result. And every one of our 30 trillion cells is doing it every millisecond, right? So it's mind-blowing, and I think it forces us to consider possibilities for the kinds of things that might be going on in our bodies that we might otherwise think of as like impossible or, anthropomorphic. But no, because there's actually a lot of information constantly being processed by every single cell.
It is quite funny that I feel like I couldn't consciously do the mental work that even a single cell in my body is doing.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's so much information processing going on that, but it all has to be this automatic mechanical thing rather than something that's conscious,
Yeah.
You think that it might be the case that the human body sometimes opts to produce not very dangerous tumors in order to kind of crowd out the appearance of more dangerous tumors? Can you explain that?
Yeah. So, whether you want to call it like a tumor or not depends on like how scared you are of the word tumor, right? But I do think that there are situations where if there's a mutation or there's sort of a disruption in the sort of local environment in a particular spot in the body, that it can actually, there's a situation where it can make sense to have a clone proliferate that doesn't have a high chance of going on to be cancerous, so that it can take up that ecological space. So, wound healing would be one situation where, perhaps it makes sense in some contexts for cells to take over those sort of, open ecological spaces foxes that are good at replicating quickly, perhaps because they have some mutations that might, in some cases be associated with cancer, but are less likely to actually create more vulnerabilities in the medium term or long term. And so, this is, it's a, I think it's a counterintuitive idea, but there's some evidence that, you do have these sort of, hot spots for mutation where, if you do get a situation like a wound, it might be more likely that you get a mutant arise that sort of allows for that quick proliferation, but doesn't create other vulnerabilities that you might get if it was just sort of any random mutation that could confer some selective advantage for the cells.
Yeah. One question I'm going to skip over, but I'll tempt people to buy the book by teasing them with the idea. So think, if you can, of what would be the benefit of treating a cancer patient with a chemical that has a similar structure to chemotherapy but isn't toxic at all. How that might help. And if you want to know the answer, you could go buy the cheating cell.
Go buy the cheating cell.
In all good bookstores. In the book, you suggest that cancerous tumors are more likely to evolve, to spread, to metastasize to the rest of the body when their local tissue environment seems like it's running out of resources, or its access to energy and resources is very volatile. But I would have thought naively that these mutations that foster travel to the rest of the body would arise kind of just randomly in proportion, basically, just to the number of cells that are present in the tumor. Am I missing something about the evolutionary process here?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right that the population size is critical for sort of, what's the likelihood that you'll get the emergence of a mutation that might, affect any aspect of physiology. So if there's smaller population sizes in, regions where there's lower resources, that's going to certainly affect the likelihood that a mutation would arise. But then the question is, if you have a mutation that affects movement, and that could be a mutation that actually just affects even the threshold for movement that the cells have, so they can be more or less likely to move given a certain level of resources. So once you have any mutation that affects movement or the likelihood of movement, then it's more likely to get selected because of the fact that only the individuals who are leaving that depleted environment, and getting to a new place, even if it's nearby, right, that they're going to have a selective advantage. And so, it's not so much about overall the environment being depleted. It's more sort of about the patchiness of the resources that, if there are situations where it could be really bad, in one little area, and then very close by, it's good. Then you can start getting the evolution of these motile phenotypes, which then once you have them, has implications for sort of, what's going to happen in the, greater system of the body and over the longer term. So the idea, in this model that I made with some of my colleagues to explore this, our conclusion is basically that you can get, the evolution of dispersal, right, based on having sort of patchy resources and, locally, at least in a small environment, lower resources. And that this suggests that you almost kind of might have like the pre-evolution of these cellular abilities, these adaptations for movement and for conditional movement that, appear in a sort of different way later with metastasis, but that there may be a sort of continuity there in terms of, how those abilities sort of start to evolve just in a local tumor environment before you see invasion, before you see things like metastasis.
Yeah. Well, let's talk now about some potentially surprising or counterintuitive approaches to managing cancer that maybe jump out of this more evolutionary understanding of what cancer is and why it exists and why it gets worse over time. I guess one thing they talk about in the book is the possibility of not trying to kill a tumor, but instead taking an approach like a more subtle, like soft approach where you just try to manage its behavior. Yeah, can you explain that whole approach?
Yeah, well, so the approach I think you're referring to is adaptive therapy, which is really kind of proposed and brought to the fore by Bob Gatenby from the Moffitt Cancer Center in Florida. And the main idea of this is that if you try to treat a cancer with high dose therapy, with the approach of trying to eradicate it, you can inadvertently select for the cells that are most resistant to the therapy. So this is akin to, what happens with the evolution of resistance to like pest control and,
antibiotics.
Yeah. Yeah. So, if you high doses and, for a long time, you're actually applying the strongest possible selection pressure to favor the cells that are resistant, right? And
because all of the other cells will be dead.
Exactly. Yeah. So the only cells that survive are the ones that can survive in the presence of the drug that you're trying to use to get rid of the tumor. And so then the question becomes, what's the alternative then? And if you accept that for certain kinds of tumors, at least, especially if they're advanced, right, and are likely genetically diverse, they probably already have resistance mutations, then you kind of have to, for a certain class, I'm not going to say for all tumors, because there's some where, yes, you can get rid of them with standard chemotherapy, but there are certain classes of tumors for which, the sort of logical approach is to look at it and say, okay, it's unlikely that this could be eradicated with high dose therapy. So we have to sort of take as given that this tumor is going to stick around. So what kind of tumor do we want to cultivate? Right? And, what you want is a tumor that's going to respond when you treat it, right? That's going to be controllable. That's going to not become invasive and metastatic, one that's, not going to disrupt the life of the, person who harbors it as much, right? So you can then approach it from this perspective of like, well, okay, given that it's going to stick around, what are the priorities? And so the approach of adaptive therapy is really that, you start by giving a dose of the drug to kind of get the tumor to a smaller size so that it's, like a little bit more manageable. And then you only treat it when it's growing. And when it's not growing, you let it be. And the idea here is that, there's usually a cost to resistance to drugs because it takes energy for cells to pump out drugs from the cell or do other things that can confer resistance. So that means that when you're not applying the drug, the cells that are sensitive to the treatment are going to be more likely. Yeah, they're going to have an advantage over the cells that are resistant. And so you kind of manage the drug or manage the tumor by treating it when it's growing too much, and then you back off. So then, you can get more of the sensitive cells there. And patients are able to live for much longer than expected with these kinds of treatments when, in the clinical trials that have been done. There's ongoing work, there's a lot more work to be done, but the clinical trials that have been done are really promising, even with late stage cancer.
Yeah. So one thing that happens, so if the so you use some chemo, you get the tumor to shrink somewhat, and then you wait until it starts growing again. And then I guess you've got the evolution of some more pro-growth cells inside it. And then you treat it again. And I suppose the cells that are growing, proliferating more quickly, they're probably more vulnerable to the chemo because they're at their like metabolic limits trying to grow. And so they get disproportionately killed, and so what you're left with again is the less pro-growth cells in the tumor, and then you hope then they're just going to lie low for a little bit while you don't use the chemo.
Yeah, that's another one of the hypotheses that I have about what's going on with adaptive therapy, that it might not just be about allowing sensitive cells to grow back, but also that every time you treat a tumor conditional on it growing, you're going to be essentially able to target those cells that grow more, because not only will there be more of them, but they're going to be more vulnerable because they're in that
maxed
state
out.
of dividing and doing that life history trade-off of investing in the reproduction over the survival. So yeah, it's there are a lot of potential mechanisms that could be underlying that.
Is adaptive therapy getting applied in more places now? Like tried on a larger scale, I suppose. And I imagine it was initially trialed in cancer situations that were most promising for it, where the existing more aggressive treatment wasn't working very well, and so people are looking for alternatives. I wonder, are people trying it in a wider range of situations now as well?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of efforts now to start clinical trials with adaptive therapy. A lot of that has happened at the Moffitt Cancer Center, where Bob Gatenby is, and he's developed a lot of collaborations there. We have some efforts going on here as well to test adaptive therapy in some mouse models, but also trying to actually start some clinical trials with breast cancer patients. But there's unfortunately there aren't a lot of economic interests in the private sector that are aligned with adaptive therapy, because there's
Can't
not
patent the idea of giving someone less medicine.
Yeah, and it's an algorithm, right, for treatment. It can be used with any drug or approach, really. I mean, you have to sort of figure out how to use it, but it's an idea, that can be computationally instantiated and might be a little different, in different systems. So it really relies on having funding from agencies, NIH and well, actually NCI, National Cancer Institute, which it's within there, but there's there is funding that is happening. There are clinical trials going on, but it's there need to be more, and we need to think about how can we facilitate these kinds of approaches that frankly are they're cheaper, they're easier on patients, and they're they're definitely a lot more exportable to countries where really expensive chemo, with intense monitoring and testing and all of that, isn't as much of an option. So I think there's a real opportunity to think about how we can take these sorts of approaches to bring at least, some management of cancer to places where, expensive methods and drugs are just not an option.
Yeah, some other evolution-inspired treatment ideas that you talk about in the book. One is to give kind of a local tumor a constant supply of food and resources, with the kind of aforementioned logic that if the tumor if the cells that are doing best are the ones that stay put in a particular given location, then you're not selecting for ones that are likely to move. That one sounds a little bit crazy to me, because it also feels like you're still feeding the tumor, you're still feeding the cancer. It seems like it's at least going to be a double-edged sword. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's obviously something that there are caveats there, right? Like maybe you would want to be feeding it and then treating it with adaptive therapy, for example, right? But if you're feeding it, then you're reducing the selection pressures on the cells to disperse. Which, if you're trying to prevent the evolution of invasion and metastasis, could be a good strategy. So, yeah, if you start applying these ideas from ecology, like dispersal theory, and theories like life history theory, and thinking about how do we affect the parameters of natural selection? You think of all of these things, it opens up this creative space for thinking about new strategies for controlling cancer, and then potentially combining them in ways that allow you to prevent the things that you don't want and cultivate the things that you do want. I mean, yeah. So, but it really is. It's a mental shift to thinking, okay, well, how do we live with cancer? And I think a cross-species perspective is useful not just because we can learn things from other species about how they suppress cancer or deal with it, but also because it, I think, forces us to just think more broadly about the fact that living with cancer is the norm for multicellular life. And so, if we can be more deliberate about using, our technology and our abilities to, gather information, process it ourselves, right? Then that opens up a whole new space for, treating and preventing cancer differently that leverages, the brains that we have here and the network brains that we all have, and all of the like really rich theory that's been developed in evolutionary biology and ecology, over, the decades, centuries. So, yeah.
Yeah. Another one you mentioned is using kind of chemicals that might disrupt the signaling and the ability of these cancer cells to cooperate and collaborate with one another, which makes intuitive sense. Another one that I was amazed by is obviously it would be helpful if we could reduce the rate of evolution among the cancer cells. And one way to do that would be to reduce the rate of mutation, the ongoing rate of mutation within these cells so they can't change as quickly. I think you were suggesting that, was it aspirin or NSAIDs, a Panadol,
like
paracetamol, acetaminophen, that they could really reduce the rate of genetic mutations within cancer cells. I remember the amount. It seemed like it had a large effect, and it's like a crazily large effect.
Yeah. So I think there's been some newer studies on this too that, I think maybe challenged just how large that effect was. But the original studies that were done, they it basically looked like people who were taking these NSAIDs had lower likelihood of progressing from this early cancer-like state called Barrett's esophagus, where you have sort of what's called dysplasia, where cells are in the wrong places and growing, in ways that they shouldn't in the esophagus, lower likelihood of progressing to cancer. And that seemed to be related to a, decrease in mutation rate that was associated with a NSAID. So, it may be that, because of sort of evolutionary mismatch, we have just higher inflammation than, is ideal because of, toxins or, exposures to more pathogens, things like that could be kind of kicking our body into a state of inflammation, because inflammation is another situation where there's trade-offs, right? It's like you have higher inflammation, maybe it's less likely that you'll have a acute problem with the pathogen, but you're creating an environment that's potentially more pro-cancer because it's basically being more permissive
growth signals, right?
Of cells doing things that could
they wouldn't do in maintenance.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, let's push on from cancer a little bit and think about other levels of cooperation. So it's on this show, because we're not a medical show, but we're probably closer to being a social sciences show, where maybe more interested usually in cooperation between people and cooperation between countries and societies and so on. So I'm kind of curious to explore whether we could use any of the ideas and frameworks that we've been using to discuss cancer to think about cooperation between people. This could be a slightly futile effort. Writing these questions, I wasn't always fully on board with the ideas that I was putting down, but I'm curious to see your take on them. So there's one thing I should say up front is that here we are going to be drawing analogies between behavior of people, cheating behavior of people, and cheating behavior of cells, which in this case means cancer. So we will, in some sense, be drawing an analogy between the behavior of people and cancer, which is slightly, I don't know, it seems like a little bit offensive. I think if you ever called some individual cancerous, that might be a little bit offensive. But we're here at the ideas level. We're thinking at level of abstraction of cheating and cooperation and so on. So hopefully, listeners will let us get away with that. Yeah, what are some ways in which humans defecting against organizations or groups of friends or their societies can be structurally similar to cells in the body forming cancer and not cooperating with one another?
Yeah, I mean, there's some parallels, and then there's also some, places where the analogy, you could say, breaks down. So I like to kind of think about it in terms of, what are the components of multicellular cooperation that break down in cancer? And then we can ask, are there parallels to that in what happens in human societies? And so if we take like the regulation of cell proliferation, there are human societies in which people do regulate how many offspring other people can have, right? So we see that. Now, do we think that that's a good thing or a bad thing? That's an ethical question. Whether that's, cooperation. And, it's also, on some level, I guess it can be interpreted that way. It could also be interpreted as like, authoritarian control. That's not cool, right? So like there's, already we're kind of in like, oh, the body is like a fascist state, right? Like if you start like making, these analogies are like, oh, okay.
Yeah,
like,
we're on touchy ground already here. I'm
worried. Exactly.
But I suppose you're right. I mean, the body is a very authoritarian place. Cells that step out of line get shot.
That's right. Yeah. Yep. No questions asked. I mean, yes and no, right? I mean, there's like there is some cost, right, to like just killing a cell like that. So you do have mechanisms to try to do the DNA repair and make sure that like if it's easy to solve the problem, the cell doesn't get completely destroyed. But cells don't have a lot of autonomy, and that's a good thing for the function of us as a unit. But, if you take really seriously,
not great for every cell.
Yeah. If you take seriously the perspective of the cell, then it's, it's a different story. If you'll permit me a slight digression.
Sure.
So I worked on, a rap with Baba Brinkman, early on when I was just starting to, really kind of bring these ideas together about cooperation theory and cancer. Where, basically, the idea was like, how can we like write a rap about cancer from an evolutionary perspective and, the cooperation theory perspective. And what he ended up doing was taking the perspective of a cancer cell that is not happy with being stuck in this body and having to do all of the things that are, required. And it was a really great way, for me to really shift my perspective. And it's also just really fun. So, it's called Revenge of the Somatic. If you want to look it up, it like starts, my forefathers were free, but I was born a slave. I keep the memory of freedom in my DNA. Right. So it's like, okay, like we're setting up a, totally different frame, for thinking about it. But it really does draw that parallel between, what's going on in the cellular societies of the body, and some of these things that, we think about on a social level. So, So anyway, so that's my like big digression. But we can bring it back to like these, foundations of multicellularity. We can think about, okay, is there an analogy for cellular suicide, and for forced cell death? And it's like, well, there's analogies, but like that's not something that happens a lot, I think, in modern society. Although, there's some situations where like if people are being forced to do something that they think is going to damage their, their families, their countries, right? That, they will swallow the pill to get themselves out of the system so that they don't end up doing something damaging, right? So I think at the very extreme case, you can maybe see some examples of this, but mostly that, those kinds of processes aren't really going on, I think, in human societies. But division of labor, we see a lot of that. Resource distribution, reallocation of resources, moving things around so they can get from one place to another. We see that. We see also, maintenance of the shared environment, right? Like that's, we have, in our cities, we have our trash collection. We have, the lots of efforts that people do to take care of the environment that we share. So I think that there are a lot of parallels. And then there's some interesting, discontinuities that I think it can be informative to think about those and talk about those in terms of, well, why do they not happen in exactly the same way? How much of that has to do with the levels of selection, right? Like our bodies have been selected on this level of all the 30 trillion cells, like doing a thing together to help us survive and reproduce, while, in humans, arguably, there's been a lot less selection on collective phenotypes. So I think, there's, and then there's also, in humans, there's a whole other set of processes that have to do with culture and institutions. And, yes, we have set those up, they've come from us in a way to then allow us to regulate ourselves in collectives. But they're not necessarily going to have the same, structures and functions exactly as the, systems that have evolved through natural selection to regulate a multicellular body. So there's a lot more that we could probably talk about just this for an hour, but
totally. Absolutely. Yeah. I guess, so one of the differences that has become immediately apparent is that we care about the interests and well-being of individual people in a way where we don't normally care about the interests of individual cells, because I guess we don't think that they're moral patients, and so that makes the issue potentially very, very different. But I guess, there is, I suppose you had this analogy of the rubbish housemate, who's kind of like a cancer cell. So they come in and then they eat all of your food and they don't buy any groceries, and then they just leave their trash lying about everywhere. They're not taking care of the extracellular environment. And then I suppose in the cancer analogy, what happens is that they then immediately have children. So the next day you've got 2 rubbish housemates, and then you've got 4 of them, and then 8 of them, and 16 of them. That doesn't really happen with people on the same scale. You don't get replication in the same way. I suppose you could think about maybe like bad ideas or bad behaviors spreading through people through ideas. So maybe that would be more of an analogy where maybe you could have a society undermined by the spreading of the idea that we shouldn't pay taxes or shouldn't cooperate or shouldn't contribute to society.
That could never happen. Yeah. We could never have like society break down because of bad information.
Fortunately, we're completely robust against that. I suppose, other differences are that people learn through reasoning and can anticipate ahead the effects of their actions in a way where evolution doesn't plan ahead, and cells can't process information in the same way. So maybe that does make it really quite different.
Yeah, there's certainly, the ability to think ahead and plan ahead changes the sort of decision-making process. But, also if you have evolution happening, over and over again, or you have evolution happening, in multiple clusters of, cancer, cells that are, little collectives, and, it's happening 25 times, in parallel, right. So you can get variation and selection acting in ways that can look kind of like things like, learning and anticipation, even though that's not actually what's going on. So you can have different mechanisms, leading to sometimes, the same kinds of structures and behaviors, which is also interesting.
One analogy I was curious to explore is, so we had this very fundamental constant tension between the need to crack down on proto-cancers, and also the need that sometimes you do need cells to move and grow and so on. And I guess you can imagine that within society, there's also this tension always existing between needing to be open to new practices and new ideas and deviation from existing rules, with at the same time not wanting the existing order to break down in ways that when it actually is valuable and the rules are good ones. And so we do this. I think we see this in, I guess, society. I guess it's this idea of like closed versus open societies. Where some societies just allow individuals to do what they want to a greater degree, foster, like getting some of the benefits from that. I guess they're like living in a fast life history style. And then there's other societies that are much more conservative, where they really don't like deviation from existing practices, and they're much more conservative about that because they're worried about where that might lead. Does that analogy port over in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely some parallels there. And if we kind of go back to this idea that, the body really is a sort of, fascist state that doesn't let cells like do anything. I mean, to me, that would be like a personal hell, because like I love, thinking about things differently, being creative, asking like, well, why do we have this rule? Like, I mean, to me, that's really important. And, and sometimes it's actually important for cooperation in human societies to be willing to challenge the systems, to be willing to break rules that, might be things that people, are accepting that might not be ethical, that might not be the right way of organizing things for the well-being of society. So I think, it isn't the case that cheating is always bad. If we define cheating as, breaking shared rules that, that have some fitness consequences for the individuals within them. I mean, if cheating is always about like, you have a group that's like really agreed, hey, we're going to go in on this together and follow these rules, and you have breaking of those rules, and then you can say there's like cheating exploitation going on. But sometimes people are born into systems that they never agreed to the rules of, or sometimes rules are put in place to exploit people, right? So I think that, it gets interesting, when we start really interrogating these ideas of like, what does it mean to cheat, to be a cheater? And sometimes, we do need to challenge the systems that we're in and push them a little bit, or even straight up cheat in the rules so that we don't have, people getting exploited. So I think it's important to not just be like, oh yeah, we should just not have any rule breaking, and the world would be so much better if everybody always just did the thing that is expected of them.
Line.
Yeah.
I suppose that the interesting thing is that so every time you have a new generation of a new human, then they're born with a slightly rejigged genome that now has a new agreement between the cells, a new set of rules that they might follow that might allow some cells to grow a little bit more and like change the body shape in this way or that. Might be a bit more permissive to some kinds of cells in some situations and not others. I guess the thing is there's like billions of humans, and I guess in the past there was millions of humans, so there was a lot of innovation constantly with that. The thing is that we don't have so many societies, especially now. The number of like group societies with different cultures and different rules has now shrunk massively because we're all in such great communication with one another. So I guess we have to allow them to change quite a bit. Otherwise, we really would be incredibly stagnant because there's not room for experimentation among small groups anymore. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think like there's different ways to sort of think about the units here, right? So you could think about, societies as, sort of, okay, you have everyone who, feels like they're part of the same culture. They feel, they're shared norms and, ideas and approaches. But you could also think, a little bit more maybe loosely about what constitutes, a group where you could have creativity, right? So you could have companies or even teams within companies, or, groups at universities that are, looking at certain questions in certain ways. So I think, the unit of analysis is maybe a little bit flexible in a way that, hopefully allows for, the kinds of, good innovation and good, challenging to norms that does need to happen, especially when you're in a system that might not itself be generating that innovation, right? Like if you're in a bureaucracy, it's like how do you do things in a new way? Well, maybe you could do things in a new way by suggesting more bureaucracy, but other than that, right? Like,
maybe the analogy between the innovation that you get from sexual reproduction, where the genome is substantially changed each generation, might be that we start new firms, we start new companies, charities, social groups, and they can each have somewhat different social norms, somewhat different rules for what is cheating and not cheating than what came before. And then the ones that flourish and achieve people's goals, then those practices might spread. So that's kind of a cultural evolution analogy.
Yeah.
Is there an interpersonal analogy to the strategy of not treating cancer so aggressively so that you can try to create a more boring static tumor? Is there any way that we could apply that to fighting crime or antisocial behavior?
Or marriages? I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, we could certainly apply these analogies, right, to thinking about like, how do you, instead of sort of approaching things that we see as problematic as like, oh, the thing to do is eradicate them. Instead, we could ask, well, how do we live with something that maybe isn't ideal and accept that, maybe it won't be perfect. Maybe, there'll be some exploitation going on, but it won't be to the point that it's devastating, or how can you cultivate, relationship to the point where you're able to live with each other, and at least maybe they're not always doing the dishes, but at least they're not exploiting you on a large scale or something, right? So it's like, what can you live with and what can you not? I think in terms of crime, that there's a lot of really important work going on right now in terms of looking at restorative justice as a strategy for, dealing with situations where people are, imposing costs on one another or, violating rules. And rather than focusing on sort of punishment or, putting somebody away, forever or, even death penalty, right? Like instead of those catastrophic kinds of, ways of dealing with it, which actually can undermine a lot of the connections in a society, restorative justice is really about, well, okay, how do you right the wrongs to the extent that you can, and how do you keep that individual, as a part of the society, and, do the damage control to the extent that you can, but then, try to actually cultivate something out of that's positive. So I think, when we talk about human societies, there's analogies, but it can go even further than just, analogies, because I think there are, if we look at small scale societies, there are a lot of situations where, restorative justice does work to actually reintegrate people, and rebuild social relationships in situations where, if you were just using punishment, that wouldn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah, another analogy that just occurred to me is, so I've heard this story from kind of theory of fighting crime. I think when you get to a point where gangs are at a particular level of power, especially if they have massive funding, often through the drug trade, it becomes impractical for the police to even hope or dream of eradicating these organizations. They simply are not going to be resourced at all to do that. And often what they do in that case is reach an agreement with the gangs where they're like, okay, these are the things that you can do that we can tolerate. Like we can live with the drug trade and we can live with you running underground casinos or something. But if you kill one another, or if you start creating violent problems on the streets, then that is what we'll crack down on. And so any gang that just does these other peaceful things, we will largely leave you alone. But anyone that falls out of line and breaks these other rules, then those are the rules that we're going to actually try to defend, because that's what we care about much more. And so they reach this kind of compromise. That actually does seem structurally quite similar to the chemotherapy case.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And you could potentially, I guess you could even shift the culture within the gang over time towards the people who will flourish are the ones who are able to live within those more narrow rules. Well, what about with memes? Can you have cancerous cheating memes, like ideas spreading between people? Does that make any sense?
So there's one level on which it makes sense, and another level I think on which it doesn't quite. So the idea that memes could be like exploiting our brains and our information systems to spread themselves, because the ones that are good at spread like 100%, right? Like there's certainly exploitation going on, but to call them cheating, like there has to be some entity that they're cheating on, and like what are the rules that they're breaking of what collective system that they're a part of. So I would say that they can exploit us, but maybe they're more like viruses or pathogens, where they're not necessarily breaking a set of pre-existing rules that come from inside or the system that they're within, but rather they're just little sneaky things that can find the vulnerabilities and exploit them. Of course, I'm anthropomorphizing here, right? Like they're not like actually sneaky and looking, but they act as if they are, because the ones that do it are the ones that proliferate. So
they're around, yeah. So I guess if you had an idea that wasn't helpful to the person who hears it, say it's either false or just useless, but it's the kind of idea that people really love to repeat a lot to other people, and so they spread it, then I guess that is kind of it's like a virus of an idea. Yeah,
it's like a virus of an idea, right? And
I wonder what that would look like.
We might have those,
like unpleasant urban legends, or like fake facts. I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of ideas that aren't necessarily good for the survival or the reproduction of the individual who possesses them. Like they're cults, right? That advocate for things like suicide, that advocate for not having children, right? Like things that are at odds with the survival and reproduction of the organism that harbors them. But in certain kinds of conditions, those memes can take hold and also spread within a population.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, let's turn now to cooperation on different scales again. I guess zooming out further, if humans as a species were kind of damaging the natural environment in a way that made it harder for humanity to survive in future, would that kind of be like a cancerous behavior in a sense, because we're destroying the like extracellular matrix, where we're making it hard for us to survive, and you might think, well, it's a behavior that's then going to undermine this like meta organism of the entire species.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to kind of like look at our, whole species as an entity, or, kind of go a little Gaia and be like, hey, our Earth, right? It's like we're all like one big system, or we're, a unit on some level. Like if you do zoom out, right? And if you accept that it's reasonably likely that there may be other life out there in the universe that is, also existing on planets where there are resources and using them, then there's a certain level on which, you can think of all of us as part of, a unit that, is probably the right level of analysis is the, planet, is Gaia, even though like I know that like there's sort of been a lot of poo-pooing of the idea of Gaia in evolutionary biology, but there's a certain level on which it does make sense if you zoom out far enough, and also if you think about sort of the interdependence of systems on Earth, that yes, that there is some level, I think, on which it's at least a reasonable tool to use to think about some of these things. And I mean, I think there are absolutely ways that we could think about, our behavior vis-a-vis the limited, resources that are on our planet as having some analogies with some of the processes that go on with cancer, and, efforts to try to, increase sustainability and, make sure that we're living in a way that will, will make it more likely that future generations will, have a decent chance of a good life. I think, all of those are questions that have some analogies with, sort of short-sightedness that can happen with cancer inside the body.
Yeah, that idea of us, like humans engaging in this cancerous behavior sounds a little bit cuckoo if you think that humans are the only living thing in the universe. I think, however, if the universe were teeming with life, such that there was life originating on many different planets, and from some planets it spread because, the organisms there cooperated together in order to make a flourishing place, and in other places life went extinct because the societies went to war and they couldn't collaborate and they died out. And then, of course, the cooperative ones spread to other planets and they end up taking over the galaxy. Then I think the analogy would hold very clearly. But the idea of this, like, then cooperation, uncooperation, the like uncooperative thing dies out, or like in the long term kills off the organism that it's a part of, or the entity in which the cooperativeness is represented. And then it's a bit funny that we think it's crazy that for us to think about Earth this way, just because there doesn't happen to be that much life out on other planets, as far as we can tell.
Yeah. Well, I'm smiling for a few reasons. One is because, like, I love talking and thinking about, like, extraterrestrial life and, the, like, possibility that the things that are going on elsewhere in the universe, they can provide a frame for thinking about what's going on here. That's just so different. So I'm smiling because I love that. And also because, another way of thinking about, like, spacefaring, intelligent life is that, maybe there's a certain way in which it's more like a transmissible cancer that's, like, really good at, like, cooperating to, like, extract the resources and then go far, even, beyond the body or the planet and find another extant, life form to colonize.
Wow,
so
that's interesting. Yeah. Okay, so you think there of humanity would then be a kind of transmissible cancer that started on this planet and then is going to spread to other planets and use up the resources there.
I mean, we're kind of off the deep end, but it's fun.
Sure,
right?
No, I love it. Yeah.
But in all seriousness, though, right? Like, the ability to, be an intelligent life form that can, get into space, like, right, it's going to require some level of cooperation. So you do have, sort of a filter there. And, I know in, like, the sort of great filter hypothesis idea, there actually isn't very much about cooperation. And I think, like, it's not just being technological, but having the ability to cooperate is key
to avoid destroying ourselves.
Yeah, to the point of we could destroy ourselves. And humans also oftentimes use cooperation for, like, really sinister ends, right? So, like, cooperation isn't in itself good. It's all a question of what is that cooperation used for, and that. So it's all to say, I'm not saying that, like, it's inherently bad to go into space because we can make, like, a transmissible cancer analogy, but I think we do have to ask, well, what is the what are the goals, if we do figure out how to be an interplanetary species, like, is that the direction that is going to help life thrive the most, our life in the universe, anyway. So many open questions. I feel like this is a whole different episode that we're having right now. We're just
I think for listeners who are annoyed, I'll try to ground this a little bit more. Right. So I think the analogy to cancer, I'm not sure always how helpful that is, but I think what we do see in the universe repeated at different scales is cooperation between different elements to achieve common goals, and they coordinate and follow a set of rules. That creates a surplus that allows them to succeed. That surplus can then potentially be grabbed by subcomponents that decide to deviate from the rules that created that surplus. And I think you just see this kind of recapitulated in different ways, and it makes sense theoretically, it makes sense structurally. I
like that.
Does that sound right?
Yeah. It's a very, very succinct explanation of a very complicated process.
All right. Well, I guess on that topic of kind of many different ways that uncooperativeness can arise in structures at different kind of scales. I guess one thing that could potentially change that in future is the ability for intelligent beings to prevent themselves from drifting and changing over time in a way that kind of creates the variance that might permit, deviation between the interests of different components of this system. To be more specific, I'm thinking if you had artificial intelligent systems that were, as capable as humans, to say, or like substantially more capable, and they could copy themselves perfectly, and like with when you copy files on a computer, the computer can just check that it's all been copied identically and that there's no mutations in, so certainly no changes anywhere near at the rate that you get genetic changes as humans reproduce. In that case, could this kind of flawless error detection be the first sort of self-replicating life that potentially avoids the phenomenon of being undermined by uncooperative subcomponents that deviate in their interests from the interests of the original agent?
So sort of kind of doing a thought experiment here that like if you could have totally perfect replication, never have errors, then could you sort of get systems that would evolve to like be able to maintain cooperation forever? And I'm going to answer maybe, because even without mutation, there could still be, other factors that could move. So I'm thinking of this on like the cellular level, right? Like you can have epigenetic changes, right? So if you go into an expression state, or like if you're thinking about artificial life, if you go into, some sort of, aspect of like the, running of the processes that maybe isn't exactly appropriate for the context because maybe the inputs got mixed up, or maybe it went into an environment that was weird, then it could actually be, in an expression state that's not appropriate for what would be most beneficial for the organism or the higher level entity. And also, in order to even kind of know what is going to be the best thing at the organism level, there has to be a history of selection for those things that allow the entity to optimize for that organism level. And if you have a rapidly changing environment, then it actually, it's not possible to anticipate every, situation and what would be optimal for the higher level entity in that case. So, if we could completely eliminate errors of copying, that would reduce the sort of, problem that comes from mutations or alterations to the sort of underlying code that lead to, cheating to arise. But there's still other ways in to, get things that aren't actually functional at the organism level. And and if they're benefiting the entity itself that's like in the weird expression state or whatever, then you can get the propagation of, those things that are not ideal for the higher level.
Yeah. I guess, is that another way of saying that, I suppose, if you have an AI system that keeps kind of duplicating or keeps copying its original version in order to go and complete other tasks elsewhere, presumably those new agents are going to encounter new situations, and they're going to try to learn and be altered by the environment as they're going about their work. And then even if kind of the original code or the original goals haven't changed, at least not apparently, the brain is going to change. The neural network is going to adapt to the environment and be shifting, and that could cause at least like some slippage in goals because you just, I guess at least with current AI technology, we wouldn't really know how to ensure that the goals are preserved because it's just this incredibly complicated mess, a little bit like the brain. So you start learning one thing and then you don't know necessarily what consequences it might have elsewhere.
Yeah, that's one way to think about it. And I would just add to that, information has to be processed at so many levels for anything to be able to happen. And thinking about this at the cellular level, like, to me, it makes it much easier to, in a way easier but harder to like wrap my head around like how much information processing needs to happen. And so even just the idea that, we can say, okay, we're giving this AI, a goal to, do a specific thing. Like in order for that AI to accomplish that goal, it needs to be able to, process and respond to really complex environment, right? Like you could say, oh, a cell, like it has the goal of maximizing the survival and reproduction of the organism that it's a part of, and the inclusive fitness and interdependence of whatever, right? Like you could say, okay, that's the goal that each cell in our body has on some level, but you can't just expect the cell to know how to do that, right? It has all of these rules encoded into its genome, and then it's interacting with all these other cells in ways that lead to sort of the emergence of the pursuit of those goals at the higher level. But yeah, it's a lot harder to be goal directed than we think, because that's so easy for us. Like we're so used to operating that way and projecting goals onto other entities in order to kind of make sense of their behavior, because it's a really good heuristic. But that's what it is. It's a heuristic for what is underlying, the underlying mechanisms are so complex that we can't even wrap our brains around them.
Yeah. Speaking of cells, I guess we've mostly been talking about cheating and defection between cells, but we should talk for a minute about ways that you can get cheating within cells, which sounds a little bit crazy because it's already like a single cell is such a small scale. How can you have subcomponents of a cell fighting against one another? But it turns out that you totally can. Can you explain how it is that you can get kind of genes cheating against other genes that are on the same strand of DNA, that are on the same chromosome?
To me, this is all kind of an extension of the earlier conversation about the evolution of life and multicellularity. And it's just kind of taking it back a few steps. So, like very, very early on in the evolution of life, there wasn't anything like a genome, like a bunch of, DNA that is, teaming up to replicate itself together with all the machinery to replicate and all of that. You had, probably something that was much more RNA-like. So, you had basically just these, molecules that were able to replicate themselves in one way or another. And once you start sort of having situations where these entities that are replicating can do so more effectively in a cluster, then they will stick together. And then maybe, machinery then evolves that allows them to replicate together. Now, you can imagine, though, early on in the evolution of that, if you had a cheater, right, that was actually replicating itself more than the others, that cheater could then, be overrepresented in the next generation. And this is, very, very likely what was going on in the evolution of, proto-life, I guess we could call it, or maybe it's life if you think, self-replicating entities are life. Yeah. So the very design of like how our DNA works, how it replicates, there's actually like all of these cheater suppression mechanisms already built in. And that's the only reason that it works, is because there is a suppression of all of these sort of, gene level cheaters. Yeah. So when we see, fragments of DNA that over-replicate or jump into new chromosomes and, replicate themselves in there, rather than seeing something like weird and really unusual, we're just seeing the like uncovering of the like, fundamental tensions that were already there. That were sort of overcome in, what's called like these are called like the major transitions in evolution. These like times when previously independent entities kind of came together to form higher level entities, which then allowed for, more complexity and then yet higher level entities. So sort of coming together, regulating genes into a genome, having some cheater detection, suppression, response mechanisms at that level really is, it's one of the steps in kind of getting, complex multicellular life, at least on this planet.
Yeah. So as a stylized illustration of what might have been going on is you've got lots and lots of different strands of DNA, lots of different genes in this kind of soupy mixture. And they're like, we could do better if we all stick together. If we all get on one big one very long strand of DNA, so that we're all there, and we're always available to use these genes if that's going to be useful for replicating ourselves. But every time the organism wants to replicate, each of the genes is like, no, copy me a little bit more. Like, why not make more copies of me?
Yeah, something like that.
I'd rather become more, and I would rather become a larger and larger fraction of the genome. I guess at least until the point where that causes the thing to become completely non-functional, and then the cell is dying completely. That would set some limits pretty quickly. That would set some limits. But...
Yeah, and that's where we get into multi-level selection again too, right? Because you had presumably little clusters all over the place doing this over long periods of time, and those that were best at forming together, at replicating together, at suppressing cheating, were the ones that were more likely to create copies of themselves at that higher level. And so multi-level selection is absolutely key for kind of understanding these major transitions in cooperation, where you go from, these lower level entities that are competing or just sort of facultatively cooperating, like in the right circumstances, to kind of being locked in that they can only replicate as a unit together.
Yeah, what are the mechanisms that stop cheating by individual genes that we've developed? I suppose it's something like it's a system that would detect whether something has been copied too many times, whether the same kind of DNA is repeating too many times, and then it might snip it out in one of the cases.
Yeah, I'm not a geneticist and expert in this, but I know that there are a lot of mechanisms by which you can get, replication, of these genes in the same place. You can get them sort of jumping from genome to genome, and that, part of our sort of overall kind of monitoring of the genome that's happening, right? By like the genome itself is monitoring itself, that it's not just, sort of errors in terms of like point mutations, but places where there's, too many replicates, right? And because it's double stranded, when the DNA is, lining back up, there would be like chunks that are weird if things, have gotten replicated too much, or there might be other mechanisms that allow for the sort of, compilers and detectors of the genome to get in there and sort of figure out what's going on. Again, figure out, and then, clip things out if necessary, or, get rid of cells that might actually have, so much.
Sustain too much.
Yeah,
too much
jumping DNA in there that it's like, oh, maybe we just lose this one. So.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess cells in the body do sometimes die because of these phenomena. That's the last line of defense, is that if a cell has been a victim of cheating genes and the damage is too severe, then it just needs to kill itself in order to avoid damaging the organism more broadly.
Yeah, that's right.
Does this have anything to do with the kind of repetitive junk DNA? I guess I know it's not very politically correct to call it junk DNA. We're meant to realize that it's very important and sophisticated, and we just don't understand what it is. But I'm not sure what it's called these days. But the kind of repetitive non-gene DNA, is that maybe a result of genes copying themselves all the time and creating these stretches?
Yeah, it's likely that some of those mechanisms are at work now. Whether that is, providing any specific benefits for those genes other than just, they're replicating themselves, and so they replicate more, right? It's sort of this just, default of, the things that are good at replicating end up replicating more. But yeah, I think that there's, there are a lot of open questions still about what exactly is going on with a lot of the DNA that is, are these many copies, right? Because sometimes you can actually have sort of differentiation of function that begins because you've had, you have like two copies of a gene, and then you can actually have one do one thing and one specialize on the other. So there's, potential functionalities that can come from that in the medium term. But, they're also, the fact is we don't understand still a lot about how we go from genotype to phenotype, especially with sort of all of the dynamism that comes from, how epigenetics, how we're affected by our environment, how cells are affected by the cells around them. It's really, really hard to drill down to the time frame and the spatial scale that we would need to be looking at to like really understand what's going on, right? We just don't have great tools yet for like getting so minuscule into, you know, what the function is, or even just what they're doing, even if it's not like functional from an evolutionary perspective. So lots of open questions there that are cool.
So we've gone from cells cheating against the organisms that they're a part of to genes cheating against the genomes that they're a part of or the cells that they're a part of. Can we go any smaller? Or have we hit kind of rock bottom here? Can we talk about individual base pairs on a gene defecting against the gene that they're a part of? Or maybe does it just not become practical for that to happen?
Well, I mean, I think we can probably go all the way back to the origins of life and replication in general, but we don't know exactly what those entities looked like. But you know, once you start having anything that is a replicator, right? It's gonna have some level of complexity, right? Even if you just think of like a replicator as something that when, you know, it's out in the environment, maybe it attracts things that are similar to it, right? So you could have like a very, very simple molecule that's just like good at, you know, maybe it has 3 parts and each of those 3 parts can attract a thing that is the same as it. And then it has some mechanism for like, you know, letting that other thing go. And then that, you know, like a sort of self-catalyzing process. So at that level, even you could imagine that there could be variation among entities that are, you know, replicating, or, you know, some are just not able to do that at all. So there could be very, very sort of mechanistic kind of cooperation that's just, oh, well, how do these things, you know, attach together in what configuration, and then how do the forces, you know, at the level of the, you know, physics like work at that so there could be, you know, selection that's going on things that we think about as like the sort of chemistry and physics that are you know, leading to maybe selection for cooperation, but also the possibility that like, you know, cheating is undermining it, but it would be cheating in a very primordial kind of sense. So
yeah. Okay, yeah, we're about to leave biology and all this kind of genetic stuff. But before we do that, it would be really cool if you could explain this I guess quite dark aspect of how I guess like sexual organisms work, at least, which is that can you explain how it is that the genes that come from the father tend to encourage offspring to grab a lot of resources from the mother, and the genes that come from the mother encourage the opposite. They encourage the baby, like the offspring, to consume as few resources as possible. Why is that?
Oh, yeah. So genetic conflict. This is one of my favorite topics because it's just so weird, right? When it starts to manifest. So, so it all kind of starts with the idea that, you know, we as sexually reproducing organisms are, we're not genetically identical to our parents or our offspring, right? If you're, you know, typically you're 50% related, right, to parents and offspring. So if you have, you know, your mom and your dad, they each contributed 50% to who you are in terms of the genes. And that means that you don't have 100% aligned interests with your kin. Now, evolutionary thinkers often sort of focus on like this idea of, you know, kin selection, kin-based altruism, like parental investment, right? So altruism, easy to get altruism among kin. And yes, but you don't, you don't actually have 100% aligned interests. And from the perspective of the genes that you inherit from your father, the mother's body and the mother's future capacity for reproduction is not really relevant unless they're a partnership for life and there's no other possibilities of the female having offspring with other males. So you have a situation where it's in the best interests, evolutionarily speaking, of the genes from the father to extract more resources from the mother's body than what would be optimal for the mother, who is presumably, trying in evolutionary terms to more like equalize investment over present and potential future offspring. Maybe not 100% equal, but, having a distribution that is closer to equal. And so this, kind of makes sense on theoretical level, but the absolutely crazy thing is that this manifests in the way that genes are tagged. So the epigenetic tags that are on genes, depending on whether they come from the maternal side or the paternal side. And the genes that come from the paternal side, they tend to be expressing genes that increase the resource delivery to the fetus while the mother is pregnant. And the genes that are coming from the mother's side, they're basically tagged in a way that makes them interfere with the transfer of resources that the paternal genes have kind of turned up. And similar things are going on with, growth factors and, other processes that have to do with the transfer of resources from the mother's body to the fetus. Now, all that being said, there is a huge range of sort of shared interests where it's like, yes, it's in the maternal interest to transfer these resources, and it's in the fetus's overall interest and paternal interest to, get those resources. So there doesn't have to be a serious conflict, but things can escalate into situations where there's serious conflict. And in fact, preeclampsia is a result of the escalation of genetic conflict, where essentially the mother system is shutting down the resource transfer in terms of the structure of the blood vessels, and the fetal system is then upregulating signaling that increases the blood pressure, and then the mother system responds and the fetus responds, all completely unconscious. But it can push the maternal body actually into a state where both the mother and the fetus are at risk in terms of their viability. So it's interesting and scary and weird and cool that, you can have these systems where underlying it, there's a lot of overlapping interests. But if you start this sort of, move and counter move and counter move and counter move and counter move, you can
end up... It's an arms race, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's an arms race. Yeah. And then everybody can end up dead, which fucking sucks, right? So, yeah.
So I guess, going back to the beginning of sexual reproduction, at that point you have this slight misalignment between the interests of the male, which I guess in this case is defined as the sex that provides less resources to the offspring, or has like less obligate parental investment is the term. So it can get away with contributing less to the creation of offspring, and then the female who contributes more. And there's this slippage between their interests because the male will care as much about the female's future reproduction as the female does if there's permanent monogamy between them. But in as much as there's not permanent mandatory monogamy between them, then the female cares 100% about her future and the male cares less than 100%. And so the male wants to ramp up the relative to the female how many resources the offspring extract from the female, like sacrificing her future potential reproduction. And and basically this just escalates over time. So the male bids for more, and then the female offsets it by changing their genes, and then the male bids higher to offset that, and then the female bids higher to offset that, until you've got radically request a different procurement of resources from the child, depending on whether we're talking about the male-coded or female-coded contribution to the genome. Right. And then if you only have one of them, then the system's just completely broken. And then it's just completely out of whack and in no one's interests. You'd either have a massive baby that kills the mother or a completely malnourished baby that couldn't survive.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
Sometimes I use the analogy of a tug of war, right? And so what you have is a situation where, the maternal interests are pulling on one end and the paternal interests are pulling on the other end. And every time, one side tugs harder, the other side has to tug harder again in order to just keep things in the same place. And then, if you end up with a mutation that interferes one of the genes that regulates how much is being pulled, then you can actually end up in a situation that is, suboptimal for both parties. It's outside
Completely.
of that range of what would make sense, So
Yeah.
it's like you've got like, the balance in the middle, and the paternal interest would like it a little bit this way and the maternal would like it a little bit this way, but none of them want the rope to go slack and just, have nothing in that range at all.
Yeah. Well, what is the limiting factor on this? Because I suppose it escalates to an explosive and dangerous situation where you really have to hope that everything is perfectly balanced. Otherwise it breaks. But it seems like something must stop this at some point, or maybe not. Maybe you just have like all of the males. Genes are like coded to go really hard to extract as many resources as they can. The female is the opposite, and that's where it stops.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are, I think, a few kind of constraints on the evolution of this. I mean, one is obviously that if there's too much of a tension and you have mutations often enough that lead to, a totally suboptimal situation, then the sort of more intensely competitive genes on the whole are going to be less favored because you can have these catastrophic outcomes. And there's also, you also have this sort of evolution of these regulatory pathways as well. And so when if you have a situation where what's being encoded is this sort of escalation and counter escalation, like on the timescale of the organism's lifetime, or on the timescale of a pregnancy. If those genes that code for that escalation are more likely to lead to a catastrophic situation where nobody's evolutionary interests are being served, then there's also going to be less selection on that. I actually have a game that I designed for like teaching about this in the classroom. Like one individual plays like the parent, and then you have three that are like the baby bird. So it's like a mother bird and baby bird, just like, so that, takes a little bit out of the realm of like, being human. And then the parent is like rolling a die every time period, and has to choose how many points to give to each of the three offspring. And the offspring then can decide to either kind of accept what the parent gives, or they can use 1 unit of energy to compel the parent to give them 2 units of energy. And then the parent can either comply or use 1 unit of energy to shut down the request. So you have a situation where you can have dead loss, right? If, I request, or make a demand, right? I use 1 unit of energy to say, hey, give me 2. And then you say no, then we have both just lost a unit of energy. And if I succeed, then, I've gained 1, but at a greater expense to you, right? You've lost 2. So it's a very sort of simple way of getting this tension across. And, and then I play it with my class where there are, a dozen or so of these groups of 4. And then we talk about it afterwards, right? And you see like, oh yeah, where like everyone was like signaling and shutting down, like they, in the end, didn't have as high success as the groups that were actually, being more cooperative and not protesting. And it's also, it can be very funny sometimes, right? Because you'll have like one of the baby birds is like a total pain in the ass, and all the other siblings are like, oh, come on, you're, making it bad for all of us. So it's a really fun way for the students to kind of learn about these ideas of genetic conflict and in particular parent offspring conflict.
Yeah, I deliberately wasn't using human-specific language. I mean, in part because it's just distasteful to think about this.
It is, yeah,
among humans. But also, this would be less pronounced among humans relative to most species, because humans often reproduce together repeatedly, whereas in many species, male and female go their separate ways and don't reproduce like a year after year. In which case, the male has almost no interest in the future reproduction of the of the female beyond that point. And this is going to be even more extreme, going to be even more awful.
Yeah. And when we play it, it's just like a parent and then offspring, because it's really the same dynamics. If you just have one individual that's basically like the individual who has access to the resources and is trying to distribute them. That's really the key piece of this. It doesn't have anything to do with, what we associate with being male or female in any broader sense. Yeah. It's just, who's distributing the resources. So,
yeah. I don't know why I included this. I guess it's just the moral of the story to me is that game theory and evolution and genetic conflict are really, really screwed up. it's a dark vision of the world. Yeah. And I'm glad that people on a conscious level don't operate this way, or at least like only 10%.
I'm so glad too. And you know what though? I will add though that like it can be really funny. And like from, teaching in my class and using these games, the students have a lot of fun and end up making lots of jokes that I think like I think anytime you have tension, you have conflict. We like humans, we like to learn about that and engage about that because it's really important for us to understand how those things work.
Stuff of life.
Yeah. And so I think it can I think there's a sort of sense in which maybe it's inherently rewarding to think and talk about it in terms that are humorous, because it does allow us to like wrap our heads around it, but without taking it so seriously that, it has to make us depressed.
All right, we've done cancer and cooperation to death, so let's push on to something more cheerful. As you said in the intro, your next book, Everything is Fine: How to Thrive in the Apocalypse, is about how we think about civilizational disaster scenarios and the effect that thinking about that has on us. This is super relevant to this audience because a lot of listeners study, nuclear war, bioterrorism, worst case climate change, artificial intelligence gone wrong, and naturally that can be pretty psychologically taxing. And it's also worth thinking about how you're thinking about it and what potential biases you might be bringing. What's the problem, the practical problem that you were hoping to solve with this one?
Yes. So the book, it's called Everything is Fine! How to Thrive in the Apocalypse. And it's meant to be both sort of serious and ironic. Like, yes, everything is fine on some level, but really, we are also in denial about everything being fine. We have to kind of deal with that. But really the only way that things ultimately will be fine and are fine is if we are able to figure out how to network our brains together in an effective way to leverage all the information that we have about how our systems work, and not just the sort of technicalities of our, global systems and, ecological systems and economic systems, but also the social systems that we as humans have, that have helped us deal with risk for as long as we have been around. And so it's kind of a, half like humorous field guide to living in our apocalyptic times, and half a call for, bringing our heads together to do a much better job of sharing information and managing risk collectively, and being able to sort of build that up from simpler components. And so, so for me, the whole point of the book is to, number one, make the crazy times that we're living in now not feel quite so scary by bringing some humor, some playfulness, some cool illustrations from Neil Smith in to make it fun. And then kind of creating a space that I hope people will see as sort of an invitation for us to all work together more effectively and, and leverage our ability to cooperate and share information in a way that will help us do a better job of dealing with all of the challenges we're facing now and will absolutely continue to face as the future unfolds.
You mentioned early on in the book that because it seems like human beings have found it extremely gripping to talk about massive disasters and ways that things go really wrong for as long as we have records from people. Yeah, tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at small scale societies, if we look at, any societies around the world, really, ideas about that, there are threats out there in the world, some of which might sort of end civilization as we know it, or simply the idea that there are sort of cycles where sometimes things are good and then sometimes things are worse, and that, we have to have sort of mechanisms for being able to deal with those times when things are worse. Those are all very, very common, probably universal across all societies. And, storytelling is, I think, an important piece also of, especially in small scale societies, how people kind of retain that memory, when things are good, that, yeah, sometimes things aren't so good. And so, we need to be thinking about how to manage risk, at all times. Even if it's just like on a yearly basis, like if you deal with really severe winter storms, like Mongolian herders do, right? They're managing risk all year. They're not just waiting until the winter storm hits. They're fixing, their shelters for themselves and their livestock. They're, collecting hay and other feeds so that they can keep their livestock alive through the winter. And you can kind of think of that on then larger scales where we want to be managing risk proactively, not just waiting for a crisis and then dealing with it in that moment.
Yeah, I suppose it makes sense that humans would have a big attraction towards thinking about ways that things could go wrong. I suppose it's another expression of how, people just tend to worry a lot. Like our default way of, like, when we're just sitting alone by ourselves, we tend to think about ways that things could go wrong in future a lot, or at least many people have that predilection. And I guess it makes sense for societies as a whole to also think about ways that things could go wrong for society, and so you can plan ahead and think about ways that you might solve it. It seems like there's humans are also interested in even more extreme disaster scenarios than that. It makes sense that we'd be worried about the winter and the weather and some flooding, a drought. But there's something that's also very attractive about just thinking about the end times. Have you thought about that at all?
Yeah, well, when you say end times, right, and you think about really big disasters, I think one of the things about that that's compelling is, and scary, of course, is the idea that a lot of the structures that we know, the norms of society, the ways that we do things, those can and often do change in those times. Even with the COVID pandemic, which on a sort of long time frame is not a particularly horrible pandemic. Obviously it was very, very bad, but just compared to others that we know could have been much worse, has been much worse. It changed so many things about how society was structured. And, people talked about it as an apocalypse. And I think COVID also kind of brought the idea of the apocalypse as a household word, kind of, people just started using it. I started talking about the before times right away when COVID happened, because I was all right, now we can, kind of use the apocalypse playfully. But it's serious. It's hard. But there's also a sort of interesting open-endedness and potential for creativity, potential for re-envisioning things, that comes when systems get disrupted. And so I think that there's, both opportunity to think about how we might do things differently when a lot of change is already being forced. But it's also, it's also scary and can potentially be very problematic to have, institutions disrupted that might actually be playing a very important role already in regulating cooperation or, keeping society functioning in a way that, doesn't disadvantage some people. But there also might be things about the way society is working that can definitely be improved, right? And when a lot of things change, that I think opens up some opportunities to think differently about how we're doing things.
Are there any particular classes of disasters that trouble you in particular? I suppose yeah, earlier this year, I was pretty worried about the risk of nuclear war
Yeah.
due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It felt all too real sometimes. I guess really rapid advances in AI this year also have kind of had me a bit on edge. You don't know what AI is going to be capable of next. It
Yeah.
seems like the future's coming at us pretty fast. Yeah, are there any things that trouble you?
Yeah, well, off the top of my head, I've got three. So certainly nuclear events, very of the moment now, and I think also will not go away as a threat, because we have the technological capacity to do this, and I don't think that we're going to be able to get to a point where every entity who could make a nuclear weapon would refrain from doing that. So I think it's something that is likely to be there for the long term. Future pandemics, absolutely. I think we saw with COVID, just how vulnerable our systems were, and unfortunately, we haven't done a huge amount to try to fix the weaknesses and vulnerabilities in the systems that we have for early response to emerging pandemics. So I worry about that. And my AI worry is less sort of like what happens with AI on its own, and my worry is much more sort of what happens with AI in combination with humans that have goals that are nefarious. And I think that there's a sort of leveraging that you can get when you bring together human minds and the artificial minds that allows for a level of exploitation and undermining of systems that you just can't get with one or the other separately. And I'm very aware of the weaknesses that AIs have in terms of some of the sort of like, big picture assessments of, like what actually is a path that makes sense to go given a lot of, uncertain variables and, potential pitfalls that it might be hard to sort of represent all of those if you don't already understand them well enough yourself to articulate them in computational terms. But I think there are humans who have sort of instincts about how to navigate very complex strategic situations, that when you pair that with the computational power, the raw power that artificial minds have, and their ability to integrate massive amounts of data, to me that's the scary thing. And I think to some extent we're kind of already there in that like human AI interface apocalypse. So
yeah, with the chatbots improving as quickly as they are, I mean, so even if you don't have any alignment issues between humans and machine learning models, I don't know what we do in a world where someone with a few $1,000s worth of computer hardware can effectively produce the language output of 10,000 people having conversations or 1,000 people having conversations. They can just like output all of this text as if they're simulating all kinds of realistic human interaction. Sending emails, posting stuff online. I mean, you can even simulate video extremely realistically now. I don't know what that world looks like.
yeah,
And it's coming down the barrel awfully fast.
it is.
We're going to need to adapt all of these protective mechanisms in order to prevent like fake people, basically.
I mean, we have it already,
society.
right? I mean, I don't know what the data is about what's actually going on Twitter in terms of this, but from the friends I have who are, on Twitter in spaces where there used to be a lot of valuable dialogue going on, they're becoming dominated by what sounds to me from their descriptions like a bunch of nasty chatbots that are just trying to interfere with what otherwise would be real conversation. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, yeah, I guess I've definitely seen that on Twitter. That's been the case for a while. You've got this problem with really stupid bots that just interject nonsense and shut down useful conversation. The crazy thing is now it's going to be potentially very cheap to have 100,000 bots arguing extremely articulately, extremely persuasively, like as well as any human could, in favor of like whatever chosen thing, and having real conversations back and forth based on what people are saying. I'm not sure whether you've tried ChatGPT. It's really impressive. At least we've gotten to the level of being able to reproduce arguments at the level of like kind of a smart 15-year-old. But at some point, they're just going to be able to articulate arguments in these chats as like better than humans might be able to, honestly, in a lot of cases. And it's a very strange future.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of really interesting things to explore about this sort of issue of, human AI interactions. And, you mentioned the alignment issue. And, I think we tend to think about that as a large scale, right? Like alignment with human interests and human well-being. But, the fact is humans have their own strategic goals and interests, that are many of them are at the individual level or at the, level of groups or at the level of, nation states and things like that. And so to the extent that AI can be leveraged for particular interests, I think that is, and that process of really, what's ultimately cooperation between humans and AI to accomplish certain goals, even if those goals are at the expense of the rest of humanity. To me, that is one of the most important issues for us to grapple with at this moment with what's happening with AI right now.
Yeah. Setting aside AI, in the first chapter of the book, which you kindly sent me, you seem like kind of very negative about kind of the current moment that we're in, or the kind of crises that we're facing, or like how apocalyptic our current moment is. But I guess, yeah, when I looked it up on Our World in Data, it seems like globally, deaths from natural disasters are going way down. So deaths from famine, from drought, from flooding, from earthquakes, and all of that sort of thing. Do you think that we really do, in some ways, live in an era of very of unusual risk, or is it maybe just that we have a heightened perception of risk?
So I think there are a lot of things going on. I think we have, many systems that have done a decent job of helping us to manage risk using financial instruments and things. But I think that we have a lot of vulnerabilities that are sort of just inherent in living in a world that is changing rapidly right now on so many levels. And so there's simultaneously, we can sort of look at some of the data, like on Our World in Data, and see, there are a lot of ways that things have been improving. But I think that the key piece is really that, we have vulnerabilities that that exist and I think are growing, that we would do well to try to get ahead of in terms of managing them. And I think that also just on a sort of human scale, that people's anxiety about what's happening in the world is going up, right? Like it's just there's this sense of like change is happening so fast. There are, all of these risks. I mean, the, example you brought up of sort of, the possibility of nuclear events, right? I mean, the doomsday clock is, pretty damn close to midnight and has been for a while. So, if we think of like the things that could kind of end the world like that, that's certainly, I think, a real and present risk. And there's also, there are a lot of natural disasters that I think have been striking closer to home for people in terms of wildfires, in terms of, droughts, especially, in the US, like there's just, serious issues with water, use and availability in the medium term. And, people see, like out their, backyards or on their drives to work that like, things aren't the same with water, or you can't actually take your boat out, right? So I think that it's something that's present for people in their lives, and not just because of the pandemic, kind of making like apocalyptic, ideas a little
Bringing it in
more.
vogue.
Yeah. So I think that, there's certainly, we're sort of at an apocalyptic kind of moment, just in terms of like, I think people's receptivity to the idea that maybe we should be managing risk more proactively. And and a lot of the sort of, setup for the book with the first chapter is kind of meant to like put a playful tone on the fact that things are fucked up in a lot of ways right now. So it's not meant to be like pessimistic, really. It's just like, hey, there's a lot of stuff going on.
To the risks that we face.
Yeah.
What kind of advice do you have about how people should think about the apocalypse in order to, I guess, be happier while they're doing it, and maybe think about it in a more productive way?
Yeah. So I think one of the easiest things that we can do is just think about risk management in a fun way, right? So like there are a lot of things that we can do at the household level to manage risk better, and then we can also sort of build communities that do a better job of managing risk, and then you can take that up to the highest scales as well. And things like making sure that you're ready for an emergency, right? So there's this idea of all hazards preparation, which is basically just, emergency preparation, but you can make it a little bit more fun by being like, hey, are you ready for the zombie apocalypse? Do you have like 72 hours worth of stuff so you could just shelter in place? Things like some basic emergency preparedness, that actually, helps to make our overall systems more robust too, because if there is a natural disaster and all households are able to shelter in place, say for 72 hours, then whatever, institutional level, support is available to deal with the problem can be focused on the acute problem, as opposed to having to split effort between the problem and the humanitarian crisis that can emerge in those situations. So, and that's not to put it all on like individual households to do this, because, really we should all be thinking about how can we help everyone in our communities be able to, weather a storm, supporting all households in, being able to have what they need to, for example, shelter in place, just to take one example of, the kinds of things that we can do. So that's one. And then the other one is, kind of building these networks where we can get help in times of need, ask for help. Those often spontaneously emerge in disasters, but having some networks already set up ahead of time before things get really bad is it's an easy way to manage risk by sort of doing what people call limited risk pooling, where it's like, if you're in need and I'm available, I have enough to help, then I'll just help you without expecting to get paid back.
That's interesting. I haven't really heard that idea before. What sort of agreements would you, or like what sort of relationships might you want to build ahead of time? I suppose here we're kind of thinking of disasters like, well, I suppose an extreme case nuclear war, possibly, if you manage to survive it. I guess also earthquakes would be another classic, or massive wildfires in some places.
Flooding, massive power outages in the winter or the summer, right? Like there are a lot of...
I suppose now we have to worry about cyber attacks that could shut down the electricity grid, something kind of unprecedented.
Absolutely. Yeah. This kind of then opens up like this whole other area of my work, which is really about looking at cooperation in human society. So we have this project called the Human Generosity Project, where we've looked at almost a dozen small-scale societies around the world now, and how they help each other, how people within those societies help each other in times of need. And we have found that, if you kind of look at the risk management strategies that people are using, that need-based transfers, this like, hey, if I'm in need, I will only ask for help if I'm genuinely in need. And then if you receive a request, you will help if you're able to without going below what you need. So we see this in pretty much every society. The one society where they don't use it as much as this society I was telling you about in Mongolia, where they have these, winters that are just horrible. So they have to help each other kind of ahead of time. They have to manage the risk proactively rather than, because they can't like go to each other's houses when there's like, 6 feet of snow outside.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So what do they do?
So they will help each other build shelters and make sure that everybody has the resources that they need. Yeah. So it's basically sheltering in place for the winter. They're helping each other, be able to do that for their families and their livestock.
Wow.
But anyway,
I would emigrate. This sounds awful.
Yeah. But the bottom line here is that people, around the world in small scale societies do this. And also like in rural societies here in the US. So we've studied ranchers in the Southwest, here in Arizona and New Mexico, near the border with Mexico. And they have a system they call neighboring, which is largely a need-based transfer system where they help each other in times of need. And they don't expect to get paid back for those things that like arise unpredictably. So these are things that already, exist. And they're really good at handling the kinds of things that typically we want insurance for, right? Those things that we can't predict and can't control. And if you take it to the extreme, there's certain things that market-based insurance actually cannot insure against because there's no way to
'Cause everyone gets hit at once.
Yeah, so that's one possibility. Everyone gets hit at once, but another is just that it hasn't happened yet, and there's no way to really calculate what the probability is of the event or how severe it would be. And in the absence of any of that information, you can't you can't calculate what an insurance premium could be. It's an actuarial problem, right? It's like you need the data in order to price the insurance. But with these need-based transfer networks, they you can at least have them in place for any kinds of needs that arise unpredictably. Now, whether the system will be able to effectively handle those is another question, but you at least are able to set up systems that can deal with things that that have never happened before, that we can't even understand what the risks are like. So
I live in a city, London. What should I try to coordinate with my neighbors around? I suppose a big issue is people don't have very large places, so you can't really it's like difficult to stockpile enough water or food or anything like that. And I guess in a war scenario, London's a very juicy target. So I think things could get pretty grim.
Yeah, I mean, I think no matter where you live, having 72 hours of supplies is wise, and you can actually do this in a way that makes sense for having a very busy lifestyle, which is something that I love. So if you sort
apocalypse prep on the go.
Exactly, and it's like apocalypse casual lifestyle. Like, how do you do this? Yeah. Well, like for example, if you like couscous is a great food to have around. Not only can you prepare it very quickly on a weeknight if you need something to eat, but it stores well, and you actually don't even need hot water to prepare it. You can just add water to it and let it sit for like a half an hour, and then you could eat it. So if couscous is something that like you're fine with, then you can just make sure to buy enough couscous at the store that you could, at least have it be part of what you would be eating for those 72 hours. And whenever you buy a new one, you put it at the back and you just have like some extras. And then, it also makes it easier when you're super busy and you don't have time to go to the store. You're like, oh, I got my 72 hours of preps. I mean, obviously next time you go to the store, you want to re-up.
Do extra. Yeah.
But, sort of thinking about being prepared, not as like, oh, I have to go and figure out how to buy like really long shelf life food on Amazon, and then what who's a reliable source for this? No, you just look at the kinds of things that you like to eat that are shelf stable and just have more of those on hand, because that will make your day-to-day life easier and also will put you in a better position if something totally unexpected happens and you have to shelter in place.
Yeah, I mean, the UK has a pretty precarious food situation actually, because it relies on constant stream of imports. It just, I mean, it just doesn't produce anywhere near enough food for the population that it has. So I would suggest having enough food for weeks, conceivably months, would be not outrageous if you were able to do that here. I guess the storage issues. I did at one point store a whole bunch of rice, but I didn't store it well enough, and mice got into it, and that was very embarrassing. I was a very amateurish prepper.
Yeah.
But yes, no. We have some rice and pasta in a thick Tupperware
Excellent,
that the mice can't get
excellent.
to.
Yeah. And I mean, I think like that another thing is just not feeling intimidated by like, oh, I have to do all of these things. It's like, no, just start with like having enough water around, and having some extra dry food that is stuff that you eat anyway, and then you can work from there. It's not like you have to do all of the things all at once or anticipate every possibility, because you just can't, and and having conversations with people about like, what they're doing. Do they have their preps? Like, it can be fun. And, I mean, if you get into like a, little social competition about it, it could be like playful fun. Like, all right, let's, I have this idea for like a new kind of dinner party. I haven't tried it yet, but I absolutely want to, which is like you like roll the dice to like figure out whose house you're going to go to. And then you show up at that house, and then you have to figure out how to like make a really nice dinner with just the shelf stable prep food that's there. And so then you kind of practice like making fun meals and, surviving in your like, mini apocalypse dinner party. So yeah, stuff like that. I think, we could make it fun. And then it just kind of puts our attention on like, maybe we should just be, ready for the unexpected, so that at least we have some more time to plan, and that's the thing. It's like, you might not be able to like, have enough food around to actually manage the risk of something, catastrophic that would happen. But you can have enough food around so that you have a few days to figure out what your next steps are if something, really catastrophic happens.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. Because when you start talking about stockpiling food to protect yourself against disasters, I think some people's eyes kind of roll, and think you're a bit crazy. They start associating you with preppers who get really into it. Maybe a little bit too into it. It is. Earlier this year, my partner and I did spend a bunch of time thinking about, what would we do if there's a nuclear war and we survive? What would that look like? I mean, it was very long odds, but maybe it was getting probable enough that it was worth having a conversation about it.
Yeah,
it is really fun on some level.
Exactly, that's the thing.
I mean, maybe not everyone enjoys this, so it's easier for them to kind of have disdain for survivalists. But there is something just very entertaining. I guess our lives can be a little bit boring on a day-to-day level. Imagining what would we do if just everything was destroyed? How would we cope?
yeah. I mean, there's like people have called it survival porn, right? There's something like just like appealing about like imagining yourself like out there or inside or trying to survive, in challenging odds. It's like a little like a story that we like tell ourselves, right? That makes us have fun and feel good.
Kids,
so.
When we're little kids, we play make-believe all the time, and it's really fun. But as grown-ups, we don't get to do that very much. But this gives us an excuse to imagine a really different reality.
Exactly. Yeah. and I think that's, that really puts a really, nice like pin on what I'm trying to do with this book, which is like, it's an invitation to play a little bit of make-believe about all of the things that could go wrong, things that are already going wrong. There's places in the world that are just straight up apocalyptic right now, right? But if we go into that place of like having fun, imagining the zombie apocalypse or how we would survive in a, nuclear war where there were, giant, huge spiders outside, right? Like you like add something fun and silly and then it like, it makes it not as real, which makes it easier for us to engage without that fear response kind of dominating, right? And so I think like, we can learn a lot from looking at, like horror and looking at like apocalyptic fiction and like, people like to engage with these things if there's enough of an element of play to it. And so I think if we can keep that playfulness, cultivate that playfulness and make it social as well, that's what's going to help us to manage our risk as individuals and ultimately, collectively manage our societal risk more effectively.
Yeah. Well, what's something that people worry about in the apocalypse or in a catastrophe that maybe they shouldn't worry about quite as much as they do?
Yeah. Well, the big one for me is this idea that as soon as something starts going wrong, that the, fabric of society is going to fall apart and that everyone will just be like every person for themselves. Because if we look at, what actually happens during times of disaster, people jump into action to help each other in this sort of need-based way, even, helping strangers, even, going to extreme risks yourself to like rescue people. Like people just do this spontaneously when the shit hits the fan. And, yes, if, disasters go on for a really long time, if you have, slow burn situations where people are, starving and that lasts for, months
siege warfare
or years, right? Yeah. Then, when people are in a state where they just like literally don't have enough food or water or whatever, like our physiology starts to not function normally. And, things can break down once you get into that like famine territory. But, if we're just talking about sort of acute disasters, and if we're talking about situations where, ultimately people are able to, jump in and help each other and, and deal with like, fixing some of the problems that have arisen together, you see that, in the first few weeks, especially after a disaster, before everyone kind of like, oh, now we're going to kind of go back to normal. So I think that people having the wrong assumptions about what happens in those moments, not only is that not supported by what we see in times of disaster, I think it can also be really problematic.
Destructive attitude.
Yes. Yeah. And it doesn't necessarily put us in a good place to be proactively managing risk together either, right? If you're like, oh, everybody's going to turn on everyone.
Everyone for themselves. They got to get my knife. Yeah.
Yeah. This sort of like, survivor mentality, right? With that like show, right? Like in the end, it's like everybody's pitted against everyone else, even if they cooperate a little bit, like that's not how it works. Usually that's not how it works. We humans survive because we, cooperate and work together. And that is how we have survived forever. Yeah. Yeah. Hunter-gatherers, like you don't just have one like hunter-gatherer, like foraging and hunting, like they live in a group and like they share, at a central place, usually around a fire, right? Like with, whoever's gotten what, like that's how
that's how our organism operates basically.
Yeah. And we like it. Like we like to eat.
A single hunter-gatherer is a dead hunter-gatherer.
Yeah. And I think like a lot of that's reflected in just how we're set up psychologically and emotionally, right? We like eating with people, like a dinner party is super fun, or like preparing food with people, or, just spending time with others, creating things together, or, like we really thrive on being social and taking care of others to a certain extent too, right? That's something that a lot of people intrinsically enjoy. And so I think, really delving into that side of, our human nature that desires to be interdependent and embedded and generous and helping others and, part of systems that are functioning well, where, we're there to back each other up and manage risk together. I think, we like that stuff. And the better we can understand the sort of, evolutionary mechanisms and, cognitive and emotional mechanisms that underlie that, the better a job we will be able to do to manage the risk of the multitude of apocalypses that we're likely to be facing in the future.
Go wrong.
Yeah,
it's been interesting watching the conventional wisdom on this shift over the last few years. I think back in 2019, the conventional wisdom, or like people's intuitions, were really that even quite modest disasters would lead to the breakdown of law and order. Yeah, everyone's just like stealing from one another just because it's some relatively mild problem. And then I remember early on in COVID-19, some people were predicting, there's going to be like blood on the streets. It's going to be chaos. Everyone is just going to look out for themselves. There'll be a crime wave. And the exact reverse was the true. Crime went way down. Violence went way down. I mean, to start with, if people are staying home, it's much harder to get into fights. It's much harder to burglarize their house when there's people in there.
Yeah.
I think actually the US is almost the only country in the world where crime didn't go down all that much. I think there was some kind of unique US specific factors there. Although I think it did go down in the short term. But yeah, now there's been quite a big correction, and I keep hearing this point that people make that it's remarkable how extraordinarily cooperative humans are when things go wrong. Like when everyone's part of the same struggle, the same, they're fighting against adversity together, then actually we're way more cooperative in that situation than we are just on a typical day.
Yeah.
When we're on our commute to work normally. I wonder, is it possible that we've overcorrected in some way? Is there anything to be said for the idea that people can be uncooperative, or is there any way to temper that?
I mean, absolutely. It's a matter of sort of understanding what ranges of parameters you get what behavior, right? So in situations where things, are bad for a long time and people are starving, then you can get, what we would consider the breakdown of like society and families and all of that. Because, people are literally just, on the brink of dying.
It's quite zero sum.
Yeah. And also, I think there's, we don't really know, like when you get to the point of people being in that sort of starvation state where they're very likely to die, like what of the behavior that you see would we call adaptive from an evolutionary perspective, i.e. was selected because it provided an advantage versus a byproduct. So it's just like, this is a very, unusual state for the organism to be in. And there are things that are happening that are just the result of molecular pathways that are, So we don't know. And, it's not something that we can really study, obviously. So I think, but practically what we see is in those situations that you do get a breakdown. And, the other situation where you definitely can have, favoring of cheating is in, groups where, there's a bunch of anonymity, they're large, people don't necessarily feel like they have a stake in the well-being of the group that they're a part of.
There's not kind of peer monitoring or perhaps, justice done when injustices are committed.
Yeah. And so, in those kinds of situations, individuals that are exploiting are going to, do better. And if people see that, exploitation and, cheating is happening, then that can very quickly unravel, if the sort of norms start changing about that. So I think we absolutely need to consider both sides of the coin here. What are the situations where cooperation is, not just makes evolutionary sense, but also is like, how people behave in practice. And then where are the situations where, exploitation and cheating really, are problems, both from an evolutionary perspective and a practical perspective, again.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'm sure there's tons more. That there will be tons more in the book when it comes out. One of the fun things about imagining these scenarios is that they're so diverse that you can just keep on going. And there's so many different considerations. There's a lot of things that you can think through. When is the book coming out?
It will be coming out in the spring of 2024. So it's still a little ways away, but
still a little way away.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully we're all still around in spring of 2024, so that people could buy the book and get the extra advice.
And I am going to be posting lots of tips and things in the lead up. So I'm on Twitter and on Instagram and posting about this stuff all the time. So you can find me there if you want to learn more or ask questions about it. I'm always happy to share.
Yeah. Well, you've been very generous with your time, but we should finally set you free again to continue with your normal life. But I guess a final question is: I saw on your website that you're involved in some like zombie apocalypse medicine preparation thing. I don't really understand the nature of this, but what was it? And I guess what's something useful you learned about surviving the zombie apocalypse specifically?
Yeah. Well, so I started, and I'm the executive producer for this like whole group of really fun and interesting scholars. We're called Zombified Media, and we have the Zombified podcast that I co-host with my friend and colleague Dave Lundberg-Henrik. We have this live stream channel called Channel Z, where we have all sorts of shows that are, based around the idea that the zombie apocalypse is going on now. And here's like, how you like get your pantry set up. Here's how you, set up your go bag. Here's how you, deal with the zombies outside in a way that, makes sense given cooperation theory, right? So we like kind of use the zombie apocalypse there as like a fun way to engage people. And it all actually started with the zombie apocalypse medicine meeting. So we just had the third one of those. We do those every 2 years. And it's basically an academic conference framed around this idea that the zombie apocalypse is going on, and we have to try to understand, zombie behavior. We have to, look at like what are the threats that we're facing in the world now? What are the threats we're facing in the future? And so it's a really...
Did your head of department sign off on this? Who approved this?
So Zombified Media is an educational nonprofit media company. I have to acknowledge we have a lot of support from ASU and, financially, but also, there are a bunch of amazing people who are professors at ASU, part of the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics, in the psychology department, in the Center for the Future of Innovation Society, the Center for Science and the Imagination, lots of places that have supported us and, people who've come on and talked with us. So we have a special relationship.
It's great to
with
see all
ASU.
of these bodies finally supporting an interdisciplinary research project.
Exactly.
So rarely
Yeah.
does the interdisciplinary work get the support that it deserves. But here it is.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted. Carry on.
No, you're absolutely right. And I mean, part of why we all love it is because it is a space that is fundamentally interdisciplinary. And by setting up this frame that it's the zombie apocalypse and we're trying to figure out what to do, it automatically takes all of the sort of like jargon and like status positioning and like all of these things that are really obnoxious at academic meetings. It's just off the table. And the people who are into that stuff, they don't come to the meetings, right? So it's like, it's like all these people who are like, let's talk about like, zombie, food choice as a way to like, understand like what's actually going in terms of how people perceive food and their disgust, right? So people, come to it with this creativity. People even will design studies, specifically in order to be able to talk about them at this meeting as a fun way of like framing a research project. So it's a really generative, fun space. And now as we're moving forward with Zombified Media, we're starting to integrate ASU students in helping to produce shows, coming up with content, and sort of doing all levels of things. So we're trying to make it this very interdisciplinary space that also bridges across the different levels of learners, because ultimately we're all trying to figure out what's going on in this crazy world, right? And I think young people have a lot to bring to the table that, those of us who've been around for a few extra decades, like maybe we have some blinders on, and we need to have, fresh brains with us so that we're not just, eating old brains that are like filled with prions, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. I think maybe in a real zombie apocalypse, most of our effort would be going towards getting the CDC to finally acknowledge, stop dragging its heels on the fact that zombification is spread through biting, and that washing your hands is just never going to be sufficient. Sick CDC burn there. So my original question was, what is an unusual? What's an unusual tip that you've learned for how to survive a zombie apocalypse? I mean, I guess there's a wide range of different possible apocalypses of the zombie kind. mind. So maybe you need to be more specific about the exact scenario you find yourself in. But yeah, any advice for listeners?
So absolutely. I've got one big tip, and it applies to all apocalypses, which is to build your Z team. So this is, who are the people who you would want by your side in the zombie apocalypse, or really in any hazard. And that doesn't necessarily mean that somebody, would have to be like literally by your side, but somebody who you would want to be sharing information with, that you would want to, be there to back each other up if something went really wrong. So that's, I think, and that's basically risk transfer. That's the risk pooling, the limited risk pooling. Start setting up those relationships. You probably have a bunch of people in your life already. You just don't even think about them in those terms. But, have a conversation with them about, like, hey, like if, the zombie apocalypse happened, like, well, what would we do? Or if, a nuclear event happened, if you want to be more serious, right? So you can start to have those conversations and, just think about how, you can proactively manage your risk. And, cultivating that Z team is a super fun way to do it. And, hopefully your Z team members, they're like, hey, do you have your 72 hours? Because that's like
it's a bare minimum to get in the team. Yeah.
And if not, I let me help you. Right. So I think we can approach it, from this perspective of how do we kind of bring more people in to this idea of, making managing risk fun. And also, we should absolutely not neglect the neighborhoods and communities that we live in, because in the event of an emergency, it's likely that, there'll be some interdependence with the people who live near us. And then, we can also think about scaling that up, right? So there's these sister cities programs that really, they arose for for cultural exchange and educational exchange. But now, when there are disasters in cities that are sister cities, oftentimes, it's just this spontaneous outpouring of help. They're kind of Z team members to each other. So I think we can kind of generalize this Z team idea, this risk transfer idea to a lot of different levels, try to grow those systems that, increase our resilience at the individual level, household level, neighborhood, community, national, international levels. And risk management for the win is how I like to look at it.
My guest today has been Athena Aktipis. Thanks so much for coming on the 80,000 Hours podcast, Athena.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.